After their intimate moments, they were having coffee in the kitchen. The air was thick with anticipation, not just for the important meeting with the vineyard's major investors later that day, but for something much more personal, more profound. As the sun's early rays filtered through the windows, the kitchen bathed in a warm, golden glow. Chanty and Vasper found themselves wrapped in the comforting tranquility of the morning, the remnants of their passion lingering in the air. They were dressed simply in bathrobes, the intimacy of their earlier moments still fresh in their minds as they stood side by side. Chanty watched Vasper with a soft, affectionate gaze as he operated the coffee machine, his movements practiced and sure. The scent of freshly brewed cappuccino wafted through the kitchen, mingling with the warmth of their shared silence. Vasper's smile was warm, his eyes twinkling with that familiar spark, but today, Chanty noticed something different. The brilliance in his gaze was dulled, replaced by a subtle weariness, as if the weight of the night had stolen away his rest. As they waited, Vasper smiled at her, his eyes twinkling with warmth, but she noticed something different about his gaze. His eyes, usually so mesmerizing, seemed tired, as if he hadn't slept. "Did you not sleep well last night?" Chanty asked, her voice laced with concern. Vasper ran his fingers through his thick, slightly overgrown hair, his hand brushing the strands that now touched his ears and nape. The gesture was almost casual, yet it held a magnetic pull for Chanty, who couldn't tear her eyes away. There was something undeniably irresistible about the way he raked his fingers through his hair, a movement so simple yet so captivating, his eyes momentarily drifting to the ceiling as he considered her question. Finally, Vasper looked at her, his smile soft and playful. "Did you notice?" he teased, though the exhaustion was evident in his voice. "I had something to take care of last night and only managed to sleep at dawn." He lied. He can't tell about his battle with Jake. "And then, when I came over to see you, well, let's just say I didn't get much sleep after that either." His voice trailed off, a mischievous tone coloring his words, his eyes sparkling with a teasing hint of the passion they had shared. Chanty's cheeks flushed a deep crimson, and she quickly turned away, trying to mask her reaction. She walked toward the table, but Vasper was quick, pulling her back to face him. He could sense her reaction. He pressed a playful kiss to her lips, sensing her bashfulness. "Why?" he whispered against her lips, his voice dripping with affection. "It's true. I can't sleep when I know you're near." His words, a hushed confession, were tinged with a teasing yet sincere affection, as his hand trailed down to her sensitive spot between her thighs, with a deliberate touch that sent a shockwave of electricity through her body. Chanty's breath hitched, the simple contact igniting a spark that spread like wildfire through her veins. She felt a shiver run through her body, as if electricity coursed through her at the sound of his voice and his touch. Vasper's gentle bite on her lip made her gasp, their eyes locking in an intense gaze before she softly pushed him away, reminding him that their coffee was ready. Chanty pointed to the steaming cups, and Vasper glanced at them with a smile. She quickly grabbed the cups, knowing exactly where their conversation might lead if she didn't. "Let's have breakfast here before we head over to David's," Vasper suggested, taking the initiative to start cooking by grabbing the pan and beginning to prepare, all while sipping his coffee. He rummaged through the fridge and cabinets, and took out, gathering the ingredients. "What would you like for breakfast?" Vasper asked, his voice casual yet tinged with a deeper meaning as he looked at her. "Pasta, maybe something simple," she replied, smiling as she watched him. Vasper nodded in agreement, his smile never fading. "I'll help," Chanty offered, her heart warming at the sight of him so at ease in the kitchen. But as they worked together, Chanty couldn't shake off the sensation that every time her skin accidentally brushed against Vasper's, it was like an electric current jolted through her body. That sent her heart racing. She tried to act normally. She distanced herself slightly, trying to avoid bumping into him. Avoiding eye contact as much as possible, but it was impossible to ignore the heightened awareness she felt whenever he was near. As Vasper sipped his coffee, Chanty noticed him out of the corner of her as she felt his gaze burning into her, the intensity almost overwhelming. She just focused on her task. She concentrated on peeling and slicing the garlic, trying to steady her breath. Vasper noticed her slight hesitation, the way she kept a small distance between them, trying to avoid more physical contact. He said nothing, but his eyes, always watching her, reflected a deep amusement, as if he could sense every flutter of her pulse, every quickened breath. But when Chanty sipped her coffee, her eyes accidentally met Vasper's, and it was too late. Before she could react, Vasper was already in front of her, wrapping his arms tightly around her waist, his lips capturing hers with a hunger that matched the passion of their earlier moments. "I can never get enough of you, Chanty," Vasper murmured against her lips, and they shared a heated, passionate kiss. Their kisses grew deeper, more desperate, as Vasper lifted her effortlessly onto the center island. His hands roamed over her body, exploring the curves hidden beneath her robe, while his mouth trailed fiery kisses from her neck down to her breasts. Chanty's moans filled the kitchen, mingling with the distant sound of waves crashing on the shore, a symphony of their passion. Vasper's lips moved lower, his touch more demanding, until he reached her core, his hunger for her evident in every movement. And she lay back on the center island, her breath ragged as Vasper devoured her with a fervor that left her trembling. His hands and mouth worshipped her body, every touch driving her closer to the edge. She could feel the tension coiling within her, the heat building to an unbearable peak as Vasper continued his relentless assault on her senses. His eyes filled with love and admiration as he gazed at her body sprawled on the center island. He worshipped her with his eyes, devouring her with his mouth and tongue hungrily. Her body surrendering to the sensations he was unleashing. His eyes were filled with love and admiration as he worshipped her with his mouth, his hands exploring every inch of her body, while his mouth stayed between her thighs. Chanty's moans grew louder, her voice calling out Vasper's name, fueling his desire and need even more. Her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer as she chased the exquisite pleasure he was giving her. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them and the raw intensity of their connection. Her body moved desperately on the center island, causing the items on it to fall. Vasper was determined to bring Chanty to the peak of her pleasure and quench his thirst for her. It seemed like Vasper could never get enough of having Chanty. And then, it hit. As Chanty reached her climax, her body trembled, and Vasper's name escaped her lips in a deep, breathless moan. He didn't stop until she was completely spent, her body trembling with the aftershocks of her release. He smiled, a look of satisfaction on his face, knowing he had pushed her to the edge, knowing she was completely spent. Filled with love, he gently stroked her sensitive flesh with his hand and fingers, kissing it tenderly several times as Chanty tried to catch her breath. Vasper watched her, his eyes never leaving her as he waited for her heartbeat to return to normal, his gaze full of love and adoration. He helped her sit up, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I love you so much, Chanty," Vasper whispered in her ear, his voice thick with emotion, still holding her close. "I love you too, Vasper," Chanty replied, meeting his lips with a tender kiss. Vasper lifted her down, setting her gently on her feet. "Shall we continue cooking?" he asked, a playful glint in his eyes. Chanty blushed at his playful gesture, still feeling the lingering heat of their passion, still reeling from what had just happened. After they finished preparing breakfast, they moved the table from the living room to a spot under the shade of a tree, right in front of the beach. The morning sun cast a golden hue over the serene surroundings, the gentle breeze carrying the scent of the ocean. They ate in comfortable silence, their eyes occasionally meeting, filled with unspoken words of love. The morning air was crisp and refreshing, the view of the ocean stretching out before them, a perfect backdrop to their intimate meal. Sharing soft smiles and stolen glances, the remnants of their earlier passion lingering in the air. After finishing their pasta dish, Vasper poured himself a glass of red wine from Chanty's Vineyard, a local brand that she was particularly proud of. He took a sip, savoring the rich flavor before turning to her with a smile. "This wine is incredible, Chanty. You should be proud, it can definitely compete with the best out there." Chanty wasn't much of a drinker, but she smiled as she watched Vasper sip the wine. "Is it true that you're satisfied with the taste of my wine?" Chanty asked, knowing that Vasper was used to drinking only the finest wines. But since they had been together, she had noticed that only Don Lorenzo's wine graced their shelves and fridge. "Of course," Vasper replied, his smile warm and genuine as he spoke. "Your wine is delicious, Chanty. You should be proud of it, it can compete with other brands." Chanty blushed, a mix of shyness and happiness bubbling within her. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice soft, full of appreciation. Vasper moved closer to her, leaning in to whisper in her ear, "Just like the owner, and the owner is even more delicious." His words sent a jolt of electricity through Chanty, rendering her speechless, her body reacting to the sultry tone in his voice. She felt her cheeks heat up, unable to respond as Vasper's gaze lingered on her lips, his eyes filled with a desire that made her pulse quicken. She struggled, didn't know how to respond. Vasper smiled, watching her reaction intently, his eyes taking in every contours of her face, her lips, her entire expression. Unable to resist, he was intoxicated by her as he captured her lips once more in a passionate, tender kiss. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "I love you too, Vasper," Chanty replied, her heart swelling with emotion as their lips met in another sweet, lingering kiss. After their breakfast, they stepped into the shower together. The steam rose around them like a delicate veil, cloaking them in the warmth of their shared passion. The water cascaded over their bodies, but it was the heat between them that truly enveloped them. They indulged in the fiery intensity of their love, their kisses and touches relentless, each moment a testament to their insatiable desire. The very air between them seemed to crackle with electricity, their connection palpable, almost tangible, like lovers lost in the intoxicating euphoria of a honeymoon. Vasper could never get enough of Chanty. Every glance he cast her way was filled with a longing so deep it bordered on reverence, as if she were the very air he needed to breathe. Their love was a force of nature, intense and unquenchable, like that of newlyweds constantly seeking more of each other. Each touch, each caress, was a dance of desire that seemed never-ending, as if time itself had slowed to honor the sanctity of their connection. Outside, the beauty of the beach surrounded them, with pristine white sand and turquoise waters gently lapping at the shore. It was a paradise, a backdrop to the intimate sanctuary they had created together. The scene was almost too perfect, like a dream that had wrapped them in its embrace. But inside, the sound of Chanty's deep, breathless moans echoed from the bathroom, a reminder that their paradise was not just a place but something they had forged together. Their love was both a haven and a fortress under siege, threatened by a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. But how long could they withstand the trials life would throw at them? And the love that others also desired to claim for themselves? After their bath, in a swift, effortless motion, Vasper teleported Chanty onto the bed. She lay there, breathless from the ecstasy he had just drawn from her, her eyes reflecting the love and admiration she felt for him. Vasper hovered over her, his smile tender, a look that made her heart skip a beat. His fingers traced the curve of her lips, a soft, delicate touch that sent shivers down her spine. They lay there, bodies still glistening with droplets of water, completely exposed to one another, every inch of them bare and vulnerable. "I love you so much," Vasper whispered, his voice thick with emotion, before leaning in to press a tender kiss to her lips. Chanty felt weak, utterly drained by the intensity of his love. Her knees threatened to buckle if she tried to stand. How was she supposed to handle today's meeting at the vineyard when she was already so spent from the way Vasper had brought her to the peak of bliss, over and over again? She laughed softly, pressing a hand to her forehead, her eyes closing in a moment of overwhelmed delight. She realized that since they had arrived on the island, the only rest she had gotten was during breakfast. Vasper chuckled too, his eyes dancing with amusement as he watched her. "What's so funny?" he asked, leaning in to kiss her again, his curiosity piqued by the sweet sound of her laughter. "Can I get dressed now?" Chanty asked, certain that David must already be waiting for them. "Of course, you can," Vasper replied, his smile widening. "But isn't the meeting at 10 a.m.? "You've still got plenty of time," he added, the teasing note in his voice unmistakable. But Chanty knew better. If she didn't get up now, she'd never make it out of the room. So, she rose from the bed, pulling herself away from Vasper's magnetic pull, and moved toward the closet. As she opened the doors, she was greeted by the sight of numerous boxes and bags from luxury brands, all neatly arranged. Shoes, bags, jewelry, everything she needed was there. She stared, wide-eyed, in shock at the sheer abundance of it all. Vasper's smile grew as he watched her reaction, his eyes roaming over her still naked form. He bit his lip, his gaze filled with desire as he drank in every detail of her body. His eyes were intense, a mixture of admiration and unbridled want. She opened more cabinets, finding even more new wardrobes that hadn't been there before. "Vasper, this is so much." Did you buy all of this? Chanty asked, her voice tinged with awe as she glanced over at Vasper, who was now buttoning up his suit. Vasper nodded, his eyes locking onto hers with a calm assurance. Actually, I didn't do the shopping myself. I just gave a description of you to some personal shoppers, and they picked out everything. I just paid the bill, he said, his tone smooth as silk. Chanty shook her head in disbelief as she picked out her underwear, slipping it on while Vasper continued to watch her dress. His gaze was warm, filled with love, admiration, and that same burning desire that never seemed to fade. Finally, she chose a dress, a form-fitting piece that clung to her curves, reaching just above her knees, with long sleeves and a subtle cleavage. The dress was a skin tone color with gray accents that cinched at the waist, perfectly highlighting her figure. She looked stunning, every line of her body accentuated by the dress, and Vasper, standing off to the side, couldn't hide the raw admiration in his eyes. He knew that when they arrived, every gaze would be drawn to Chanty, especially Prince Raphael's. The thought made him jealous. Chanty then selected a pair of sandals to match her dress, her movements graceful and deliberate. Vasper watched her, mesmerized, as she picked out a pair of beige high heels. Even the size of her feet had been perfectly accounted for, and the heels fit like a glove, adding to her already irresistible allure. Chanty's entire look was that of a goddess, her beauty so striking it was almost otherworldly, tempting the eyes of any man who dared to look her way. She completed her outfit with a matching bag from the collection Vasper had so thoughtfully provided. Her hair and makeup would be handled by Brenda once they met up with David, but even before Chanty could finish preparing, Vasper was already beside her, pulling her into his arms. He held her close, his embrace tight, and kissed her passionately. Once again, their lips met in a kiss that felt like it would never end, a kiss that spoke of a love so deep, it transcended time itself. While everyone in David's household was preoccupied, Chanty and Vasper teleported to Chanty's room. However, their sudden reappearance hadn't gone unnoticed, and David's sharp instincts alerted him to their presence. He swiftly ordered Lorena to head to Chanty's room. By this time, Chanty and Vasper had already changed into new outfits. Chanty, stunning as ever, needed only a touch of makeup and a quick fix of her hair, though her natural beauty was already breathtaking, requiring no enhancements. Lorena knocked on the door, and Chanty opened it with a warm smile. Peeking into the room, Lorena whispered cautiously to Chanty, making sure her voice was barely audible so that Vasper, who was sitting on the bed and watching them, couldn't hear. Vasper smiled slightly, curious about what Lorena was saying to Chanty, though he pretended not to hear anything. "Miss Chanty," Lorena murmured, her tone filled with concern, "Sir David said that Sir Vasper shouldn't leave the room. Brenda is here with 3 assistants, and they might recognize him as Princess Samara's boyfriend," Lorena said, causing Chanty's expression to falter. She glanced briefly at Vasper, then back at Lorena, nodding slowly in agreement. Lorena then left the room quietly, leaving Chanty to digest the unsettling news. A wave of anxiety surged within her chest, her thoughts racing with the implications. What would Brenda think if she saw Vasper in her room? She hadn't considered this possibility, and she was grateful for Lorena's warning. As Chanty stood by the door, her hand still on the doorknob, she was overwhelmed with sorrow. Tears welled up in her eyes as she struggled to suppress her emotions, unable to bear the thought of what others might assume. Vasper heard everything Lorena said and felt the pain of seeing Chanty so affected by David's warning. Chanty, on the verge of tears, stood facing the door, struggling. Turning away from the door, she faced Vasper, but before she could take another step, he was suddenly right in front of her, closing the distance between them. Without hesitation, Vasper pulled her into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry," he whispered in a hushed tone, lifting her chin so their eyes could meet. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw the tears brimming, ready to spill over. The sight of her pain struck him deeply, knowing that Samara's shadow still loomed over their lives, despite her no longer being a part of his. The weight of the situation bore heavily on Vasper. It pained him to see Chanty so distressed over Samara, even though Samara was no longer in his life. How could he remove Samara from Chanty's life when she had now become involved in Chanty's vineyard business? "I'm so sorry. Please forgive me," Vasper said, desperate to stop the tears streaming down Chanty's face. He kissed Chanty passionately, tasting the salt of her tears as they mingled with the kiss. He gently wiped away her tears, his expression filled with regret and sorrow, as he struggled to find the right words. "I love you, Chanty," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "It hurts me to see you like this. Can we not think about what others might say about us? They have no business interfering in our lives. Their opinions don't matter. What matters is us, Chanty. Our feelings for each other." His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he tried to reassure her, ensuring his voice wouldn't be heard outside. Yet, Chanty didn't respond. Instead, she turned to the mirror, meticulously fixing her hair and wiping away any traces of tears, knowing that Brenda was waiting for her. She avoided looking at Vasper, her mind clouded with a mix of emotions. Vasper watched her, his heart heavy with guilt, regret, and an overwhelming sense of love and compassion for Chanty. He was also filled with anger at himself and at Laika for the situation they were in. As Chanty prepared to leave the room, Vasper grabbed her arm, desperation in his voice. "Chanty, please. Look at me. You're avoiding my eyes. Please." Vasper pleaded as he lifted Chanty's chin again to meet her gaze. Chanty finally looked into his eyes, her feelings a whirlwind of confusion and pain. She wasn't angry at Vasper, but at herself. No matter what happened, she could never bring herself to be mad at him, which only made her angrier at herself. She felt powerless to distance herself from Vasper, trapped in the chaos that Samara and Vasper's past had created. How long would she hide in Vasper's shadow? How long could she keep hiding? These were questions she had no answers to. Their eyes met, and Vasper kissed her deeply, passionately, pouring all his love into the kiss as he held her close. He embraced her tightly, as if afraid to ever let her go, feared she might slip away. Chanty allowed him to kiss her but did not return the embrace. "I love you so much," he whispered against her lips, his voice filled with an intensity that made her heart ache. At that moment, outside the room, they heard Brenda asking where Chanty was, whether she should do her makeup in Chanty's room or in the living room. Startled, Chanty quickly pulled away from Vasper and hurried out of the room, leaving him behind with a heavy heart. Vasper stood there, his face and chest weighed down by sorrow. The fact that Chanty hadn't returned his embrace, his kisses, or even responded to his declaration of love, tore at him. These were the things that mattered most to Vasper, the things that brought him joy and completed his day. They were also the things that broke his heart and ruined his day if he couldn't get them from Chanty. Those were the things that mattered most to Vasper, the things that made his heart complete. Without them, he felt a deep emptiness inside. Vasper paced around Chanty's room, listening intently to what was happening outside, trying to gauge what was happening. He overheard David asking about Jake. They had agreed that Jake would teleport Justin to Laika's mines as part of their mission to investigate illegal activities at Laika's mining operation. Vasper's emotions shifted, and he suddenly became serious. Jake was likely gone. There was no way he could have survived on that island without water, food, and with his injuries. The wound Vasper had inflicted on Jake's abdomen was severe, and he knew that Jake had lost a lot of blood. The island Jake was on was desolate, making survival nearly impossible. Vasper's expression hardened as he continued to listen. His stern eyes focused on the door, but his thoughts were on David. He listened carefully. He heard Marco suggest having Vasper teleport them, but Jacob protested, saying he didn't trust Vasper. Vasper chuckled at Jacob's words. He remained silent, though, letting their conversation unfold. Eventually, David and the others fell silent. As the house grew quieter, Vasper then heard the TV in the living room playing loudly, the noise of commercials reaching his ears. He also faintly heard Brenda's praises for Chanty's beauty as she prepared her. Vasper felt like a prisoner in Chanty's room, unable to leave for fear of being seen by others. Meanwhile, Chanty sat on a stool as Brenda tended to her face, who applied light makeup as Chanty preferred. Brenda's assistant also took care of Chanty's hair. Chanty watched Brenda's face closely as she applied makeup on her. She couldn't help but admire Brenda's beauty. There was no denying how stunning Brenda looked, especially with her makeup. However, Brenda's outfit was quite revealing, with a deep cleavage and a high slit in her skirt, complemented by knee boots. Chanty had noticed before that Brenda seemed to have a crush on Jacob. This thought made Chanty smile as she observed Brenda, speculating that Jacob might be the reason Brenda dressed so provocatively. While they were in front of the TV, which was on, Brenda's other assistants, who had no other tasks, watched it. Brenda brought an outfit for Chanty to wear, but Chanty refused to change into it because Brenda had chosen something far too sexy for her comfort. "You're my favorite client, Miss Chanty," Brenda said with a grin, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "It takes so little work, but the results are always outstanding, don't you think?" Brenda marveled at Chanty's face, clearly delighted with the results. "My God! What a beautiful lady! It's like you caught every drop when God showered beauty down upon the world, Miss Chanty," Brenda added, her tone full of genuine admiration. Chanty smiled in response, and Brenda's colleagues grinned widely as well. Brenda glanced at Chanty's chest. "Aren't you just 18? But those boobs of yours are something else, even better than mine," Brenda commented, comparing their chests. "And these boobs of yours put mine to shame." She compared her own to Chanty's, playfully. "They're real, right?" Chanty burst into laughter, and everyone in the room laughed along. Brenda was quite playful, never boring to be around. Chanty felt a bit embarrassed by all the compliments she was receiving from Brenda. "I'm sure your boyfriend is well fed with those, huh? He won't regret it," Brenda whispered to Chanty, making sure only they could hear, though Brenda was unaware that everyone in the house, except Lorena, Samuel, and the cooks who had no powers, could actually hear her. Chanty was left speechless, staring at Brenda, but she couldn't help but feel embarrassed. Her face flushed, knowing that Vasper, even from his room, had likely heard everything. "You're really lucky, Chanty, having Prince Raphael as your boyfriend," Brenda said with an overly sweet smile. "I mean, he's the lucky one," Brenda corrected herself. Chanty felt like she had been doused with cold water upon hearing that. People actually believed what they saw on TV and read in the papers. The smile vanished from Chanty's face as she declared, "Raphael and I aren't a couple, Brenda." Brenda was momentarily stunned, staring into Chanty's eyes. "Oh, sorry," Brenda mumbled, falling silent as the others in the room eyed Chanty with curiosity. "None of what they say on TV or in the papers is true," Chanty added firmly. "Wow, TV really knows how to fabricate stories just to get viewers, huh? My God. I thought it was all real." "Even about Vasper Mondragon and Samara?" Brenda asked, shocked. But Chanty wasn't in a position to discuss Vasper and Samara. "I believed it because I have a friend who attended Samara's birthday party. She said she saw a video, and they've known each other since they were 17, so they've been together for almost 3 years, right?" Brenda added as she applied blush to Chanty. "You know, your blush looks so natural, Chanty, it's really enviable," Brenda commented. Chanty was thankful that the topic had changed because her hands were beginning to feel cold at the mention of Samara again. "Samara is really lucky to have Vasper, isn't she?" Brenda suddenly remarked. "I mean, you've seen Vasper, right? My God. He's like the devil incarnate, sent to Earth to tempt women," Brenda continued, her words animated as she looked at her assistants. "He's so hot and strikingly handsome, with a super strong sex appeal. If I were Samara, I wouldn't let him go," Brenda added, causing her assistants to laugh. "But did you see the news? They were fighting in the car," one of Brenda's assistants, sitting on the sofa, commented. Chanty's heart began to pound faster. "Oh yes. Their relationship is reportedly on the rocks. They say Vasper found another woman, younger and more beautiful than Samara. Imagine, who could that be? Samara is already so hot and beautiful, what more could Vasper want? My God, men really can't be satisfied with just one woman, they always look for extra," Brenda remarked. Suddenly, Chanty stood up and looked at Brenda seriously. "I think my makeup is done, Brenda," Chanty said, unable to bear listening to Brenda's comments any longer. Brenda looked at Chanty. "It's perfect, Miss Chanty. You're so gorgeous, even as a woman, I could fall for you," Brenda said, looking at Chanty from head to toe. "My God. A perfect creation of God." You could be a model for anything. Why not join Miss Universe, Miss Chanty, so the whole world and the universe can see your beauty, Brenda said impulsively. Her 3 assistants laughed along. By the way, thank you so much. You made my job so easy, no effort at all, but the result is outstanding thanks to your natural beauty, Brenda added. Shanta smiled at Brenda, though she found Brenda's bluntness a bit overwhelming. Just then, David came out of the kitchen, and they knew that Brenda's work was done. David smiled at Brenda as he looked at her. Thank you, Brenda, David said. Brenda smiled back as she packed up her things. Welcome and thank you, David. No problem, my services are always available for you and Chanty, Brenda replied, though her eyes had shifted to Jacob, who was standing behind David. Brenda seemed flustered by Jacob's presence. Jacob was dressed formally in a suit, exuding a strikingly powerful and handsome aura that was impossible for any woman to resist. However, Jacob's eyes were fixated on Chanty. Brenda gave Jacob a weak smile, and Brenda's assistants noticed her gesture, making it clear that she had feelings for Jacob. They smiled knowingly at each other. But then they all noticed Samara and Vasper's faces on the TV screen, with breaking news displayed. Everyone turned their attention to the TV, including Chanty, whose anxiety grew as she watched the screen. Look at that devil, so handsome, Brenda blurted out, referring to Vasper. They all watched Vasper walk powerfully toward his car in slow motion, getting into the vehicle while Samara, who had run after him, suddenly jumped into the car without Vasper noticing. The scene of Samara in the car, her hair disheveled yet still stunning and even sexier as her body was revealed, played out on the screen. Everyone watched the TV intently. According to the reports, Vasper had broken up with Samara, but Samara refused to accept it. It was said that Vasper and Samara had been separated for a while, but Samara was the one who had the problem. Brenda suddenly interjected, "That's right, Samara, don't let Vasper break up with you. My God, if he were my boyfriend, I'd fight for him to the grave." All eyes turned to Brenda, who was emotionally invested in the news playing out on TV. Her voice shaking with emotion. She was visibly affected by the news, fully siding with Samara. Right? It's such a waste of a 3-year relationship, you have to fight for it. It's not fair for a guy to just break up with you after taking advantage of you for years, then dump you because he found someone younger and prettier. Isn't that unfair? If that were me, I'd hire a detective to follow him, and I'd shave that other woman's head. Just saying, Brenda said with emotion, her body trembling as it was clear she was deeply affected by the news. Shanta looked at David. She didn't know what expression she had, but it was evident in David's eyes that they were somewhat shocked or something. Without a word, Chanty walked toward her room, not looking back. But before she could reach her room, she heard Samara's voice being interviewed. She stopped and turned to look back at the TV. Samara looked absolutely stunning on camera, her confidence radiating as she faced the reporters. Shanta's body trembled as she watched Samara speak. Marco and Justin were sitting in the dining area, watching Chanty with concerned expressions. Jacob also looked back at Chanty. I want to clarify to everyone that the news of Vasper and I breaking up is not true. In a relationship, misunderstandings are normal, but we haven't reached the point of breaking up. That will never happen. I want to put an end to these false reports. Also, there is no other woman in Vasper's life. That's not true. It would ruin his image. There's no other woman, and we are not broken up. Please, stop spreading these false rumors. There's a misunderstanding, but it's not because of a third party, Samara explained. But then the reporter asked, Miss Samara, regarding the other reports, some have claimed that Vasper was seen with someone else on an island. There are videos and photos, but they haven't been released to protect the woman's identity because she is younger and reportedly more beautiful than you. What do you say about that? At this, Chanty felt as though her world was crumbling. Samara burst into a laugh that was as surprised as she was. Her demeanor remained poised in front of the camera. Regarding that, I won't give my opinion, as we don't know the source or who said it. That's all. Thank you. With that, she walked briskly towards a sleek black car, flanked by bodyguards. The cameras continued to follow her, even as her car sped away, eventually disappearing from the reporter's sight. Chanty, who had been watching the television, felt like she was in a daze. Instead of heading to her room, she found herself walking toward the dining area, desperate to avoid Vasper at this hour. Brenda, who was also watching TV with David, sat on the sofa, engaged in a brief conversation. Meanwhile, Jacob followed Chanty to the dining table where she sat, with Marco and Justin looking on, their silence heavy with the tension between Vasper and Chanty. Chanty searched for Lorena, who quickly approached. She motioned to Lorena to retrieve her bag from the room, not wanting Vasper to overhear that she had asked for her bag because she had no intention of returning to the room. Lorena left to fetch it, but it took her longer than expected to return. Jacob took a seat across from Chanty, and everyone else in the room grew concerned as they noticed how numb Chanty seemed. She had yet to fully process the events that had unfolded. Finally, Chanty stood up and asked Justin to take her to the vineyard, deciding she would head there early. Justin, however, indicated with a gesture that he and Marco had other plans, leaving Jacob to accompany David to the vineyard. David was still busy talking with Brenda, so Chanty silently gestured for Jacob to take her instead. Without making a scene and a noise, they all understood that Chanty was trying to avoid Vasper. Jacob immediately stood and headed outside, his steps swift and precise as he passed by David and Brenda, who watched him intently. He hurried to his car, moving quickly as he prepared the vehicle, knowing Vasper's capabilities and the need for urgency. Chanty soon followed, hearing snippets of David and Brenda's conversation about the damage to David's living room and gate as she exited the house. She merely signaled David that she was leaving, and Brenda, understanding the situation, nodded without asking questions. David, too, understood and simply nodded back. Chanty didn't wait for Lorena to return with her bag. She was certain Vasper had prevented Lorena from leaving the room with it. She hurried to Jacob's car and quickly got into the passenger seat. As soon as she was seated, Jacob drove off at high speed, his eyes focused on the road. Chanty immediately buckled her seatbelt and stared out the window, on the verge of tears, but she held them back. Her makeup, carefully applied by Brenda, remained intact as she reached for a tissue from the box inside the car. Jacob, serious and deeply concerned, glanced at her as he drove. "Chanty, it's better to cry than to hold it in. It'll only make it harder to breathe," Jacob said, his eyes on the road ahead. Chanty forced a smile, looking out the window. She couldn't understand how she had managed to suppress her tears so far, feeling numb all over. Her thoughts drifted to Vasper, who she had left behind in her room. She wished she could flee to a place where Vasper could never find her. Then she remembered her ring, the red diamond with a tracker embedded in it. She had forgotten to leave it at David's house. As the car sped down the road, Chanty suddenly broke down, unable to hold back her sobs any longer. Jacob clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He said nothing, though his heart ached to see the woman he loved in so much pain because of another man. If he could, he would take all her pain away. Jacob pulled over under the shade of a tree, turning to face Chanty. "Are you sure you can face Samara right now? If not, we can go back. It might only make things worse when we reach the vineyard," Jacob said, his voice full of concern for Chanty's emotional state. It hurt him to see her cry over a man. If he could take her pain away, he would have done so long ago. "Let's go, Jacob. I just need a little time away from Vasper. Please." Chanty replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob felt a pang of sympathy as he looked at Chanty. If he could hold her, he would, but he restrained himself out of respect and a promise he made to himself to keep his distance. But now, Chanty needed comfort. What was he supposed to do? Jacob started the car again, driving down the road. Chanty's sobs quieted down, but she continued to cry softly, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery. Suddenly, Vasper appeared in the back seat behind Chanty, startling both her and Jacob. Vasper was holding Chanty's bag. He said nothing, his eyes fixed on Chanty's reflection in the rearview mirror. Chanty avoided looking at the mirror, trying to ignore Vasper's presence. Jacob, knowing the gravity of the situation, remained silent, continuing to drive without acknowledging Vasper's arrival. He respected their privacy, knowing that Chanty needed emotional support, and Vasper was the source of her turmoil. Chanty felt Vasper's hand slowly touch her shoulder, sending a jolt of electricity through her body. She inhaled deeply, wondering how Vasper's touch could electrify her entire being. His warm hand seemed to radiate energy throughout her. She quickly removed his hand, but Vasper persisted, brushing his fingers along her arm. Chanty tried to push his hand away, but Vasper grasped it firmly, refusing to let go. Their palms met, and Chanty was taken aback by Vasper's actions. She couldn't pull away anymore. The warmth of Vasper's hand spread through her entire body. Jacob continued to drive, never once glancing at the two beside him. He respected their privacy, knowing Chanty needed emotional support now more than ever. Vasper leaned closer to Chanty and kissed the back of her hand, his lips lingering on her skin. Chanty felt the warmth and softness of his lips, the sensation spreading through her entire body. "Come here," Vasper whispered in a hushed tone. Chanty, intoxicated by Vasper's voice, didn't listen, but Vasper didn't stop pulling her hand. "Come here," he repeated softly. Embarrassed that Jacob might notice, Chanty unbuckled her seatbelt and moved to the back seat beside Vasper. Vasper pulled Chanty gently onto his lap. She tried to sit beside him, but he wouldn't let her move. He took her bag and looked at Jacob. "Chanty won't be attending the meeting. I'll take her back." "You and David can handle it," Vasper said firmly. Chanty opened her mouth to protest, but before she could say anything, they suddenly vanished from the car. Jacob kept driving, not reacting to their disappearance, knowing better than to get involved. From Jacob's car, Chanty was teleported into the secluded living room of their private island beach house. The moment she recognized the place, she closed her eyes, trying to brace herself for what was to come. But before she could steady her emotions, Vasper was already by her side, wrapping her in a fierce embrace. His voice trembled with raw emotion as he whispered in her ear, "I love you so much. Please forgive me. I can't stay away from you. I'm so sorry, Chanty. I love you too much. I can't leave you, I can't distance myself from you." His words were like a soft, desperate plea, each syllable dripping with an intensity that pierced her heart. His breath brushed against her ear as he spoke, the warmth of his voice both comforting and heartbreaking. Chanty kept her eyes shut, trying to hold back the tears, but they escaped anyway, silently tracing down her cheeks. Vasper, ever attentive, gently wiped them away with his fingers before kissing her lips with a tenderness that made her heart ache. She fought against the overwhelming tide of emotions surging within her, but the pull she felt towards him was undeniable. As much as she wanted to push him away, angered by his entanglement with Samara, she couldn't deny the deep connection that tethered her to him. His presence was magnetic, impossible to ignore, and even the slightest touch of his skin against hers brought a sense of peace she couldn't find anywhere else. Was it wrong to love him so deeply? Was she at fault for lacking the strength to walk away? She was lost in a whirlwind of questions, her mind torn between what was right and what her heart yearned for. Who truly belonged at Vasper's side, her or Samara? Then, his lips touched hers again, gentle and soft, each kiss a silent apology, a vow of love. Chanty didn't resist. She kept her eyes closed, as if by doing so she could avoid facing the reality of Vasper's presence. She used the darkness behind her lids as a shield, but it couldn't keep him away. His embrace grew tighter, his kisses more persistent, filled with a desperate need to convey his feelings. Vasper was relentless in his affection, determined to make her understand how deeply he loved her, to show her that she had no reason to be jealous of Samara. His love for Chanty was unwavering, and he wanted her to feel it in every touch, every kiss. It pained him to see her avoiding him, refusing to look at him, but he couldn't let her go. He couldn't walk away and watch her slip through his fingers. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her. Chanty remained still, her eyes shut tight, resisting the sweetness of Vasper's kisses, though she was on the verge of surrendering. But she held on, trying to maintain some semblance of control. Vasper, however, didn't release her from his embrace. He paused his kisses for a few seconds, and the only sounds that filled the room were the soft crashing of waves against the shore and the steady rhythm of their breathing. Chanty's curiosity was piqued by Vasper's sudden pause, but his hands remained on her body, warm and reassuring. She waited, listening to the stillness around them, her heart pounding in her chest. Unable to bear the silence any longer, Chanty slowly opened her eyes, only to find his face inches from hers. He had been watching her the entire time, his gaze tracing the delicate contours of her face, his eyes filled with an intensity that took her breath away. Their eyes met, and in Vasper's gaze, she saw the depth of his emotions. But she also noticed the exhaustion etched on his features, the signs of sleepless nights. Yet even in his fatigue, his handsomeness remained undiminished. He was still the most beautiful, strikingly handsome man she had ever seen. Brenda had been right. He looked like the devil incarnate, a creature sent to tempt women. Even Chanty, despite her best efforts, had fallen under his spell. She had no strength left to resist him, no power to distance herself from his presence. Samara, too, was a victim, fighting to keep him from slipping away. His expression was intense, his eyes piercing into her soul. They were caught in a silent exchange, their eyes speaking volumes as her heart raced, countless thoughts swirling in her mind. She gazed at Vasper's face, every detail perfect, even his tousled hair. And his lips, those lips that had brought her so much joy, that she could never grow tired of, lips she always longed to taste. She could stare at Vasper's face forever, those eyes filled with emotion, the only thing capable of melting her resolve. She felt like wax, softening and melting under the heat of his gaze. Chanty wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Her lips parted, but they failed to produce sound. The temptation in his eyes was overwhelming, and she had no power to resist it. Their silent gaze was suddenly broken as Vasper's lips crashed onto hers with a burning intensity, a kiss filled with passion, love, and an undeniable hunger. It was a kiss she couldn't resist. Her body responded to him instinctively, surrendering to the fire he ignited within her. Vasper's embrace tightened further, his hands pulling her closer as he whispered against her lips, "I love you so much, Chanty." His declarations of love were punctuated by kisses that grew deeper, more fervent, each one a testament to the depth of his feelings. "Chanty, I love you," he repeated endlessly, the words spilling from his lips between kisses that grew more passionate by the second. Finally, Chanty surrendered, opening her mouth and allowing Vasper to explore her fully. His tongue and lips claimed hers with a hunger that left her breathless, gasping for air as she was consumed by the heat of his kisses and the strength of his hold. Gently, Vasper laid Chanty down on the sofa, his body pressing down on hers as he positioned himself between her thighs. Their lips remained locked in a fervent kiss, their connection deepening with every passing second. Vasper's deep groans vibrated against her lips, sending shivers down her spine as his hands began to roam over her thighs, exposed as her dress rode up to her waist. Chanty's hands wrapped around Vasper's neck, her fingers threading through his hair, holding him close as his hands explored her body. "I love you," Vasper murmured repeatedly against her lips, his voice a soft, breathless whisper. Finally, their lips parted, and Vasper knelt before her, gazing down at her as she lay open before him, vulnerable and beautiful, with him between her thighs. Slowly, he began to remove her dress, pulling it up with deliberate slowness. The fabric slipped away, revealing Chanty's flawless form, her skin glowing. Vasper's eyes darkened with desire as he unclasped her bra, exposing her beautiful breasts. Chanty gasped at the sensation when Vasper cupped her breasts with hands full of longing, his touch hot and electric, sending waves of pleasure through her entire body. His gaze was full of reverence as if he were worshipping her, each touch filled with awe. Vasper's hands moved to her lingerie, slowly removing her panties with the same deliberate care. Chanty lifted her hips to help him, and soon she lay completely bare before him, her legs spread open, vulnerable and exposed. Vasper's gaze roamed over her most intimate parts, the sight of her smooth, flawless skin making his desire for her even stronger. He didn't question how she kept herself so perfectly groomed, he only admired the beauty of it. Vasper, filled with adoration, gently stroked the delicate area, his fingers brushing over her sensitive flesh, and Chanty let him, watching him closely, her gaze locked on his. Vasper's eyes were glazed with desire as he took in every inch of her body, one hand remaining on her breast while the other rested on her sensitive core. Chanty's breath hitched, her body trembling at his touch. Vasper's eyes never left hers, filled with love, awe, and reverence as he worshipped every inch of her. Chanty gasped, her eyes fluttering shut as she surrendered to the sensations he brought with every stroke of his hands. She lay completely open before him, offering herself in love and desire. "I love you so much, Chanty," Vasper whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Chanty couldn't respond with words, only a deep moan escaped her lips in response to his heartfelt declaration. Vasper savored the moment, taking in every curve, every tremble of her body as his hands glided over her skin. His love for her was boundless, and even as his desire threatened to consume him, he held back, careful not to take her virginity, a testament to his deep love for her. He wanted to spend the rest of his life with Chanty, to build a future together, free from the chains of Alexander Mondragon's control. Despite his overpowering need to claim her completely, Vasper maintained control, knowing that their time would come, a time when they would be free to love each other without limits. After their intimate moments, Vasper and Chanty lay entwined in each other's arms, their bare bodies cocooned in the warmth of the soft covers. The passionate fire between them had ignited in the living room and transported them here, to a place where words were unnecessary. Their connection transcended language, eyes locking, breath synchronizing, hearts beating as one. Chanty was nestled securely in Vasper's arms, her delicate fingers tracing the contours of his lips, a gesture brimming with tenderness and unspoken love. "I love you, Vasper," Chanty whispered, her voice sultry and laden with longing. A radiant smile spread across Vasper's face, illuminating the depths of his joy. He had been waiting for those words to spill from her lips. Without hesitation, he captured her mouth in a kiss that was as passionate as it was filled with the intensity of his emotions. "I love you more, Chanty, thank you. Finally, I've heard those words I've been yearning for," Vasper murmured against her lips, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't be at ease until I hear you say it, Chanty," he added, his voice full of sincerity and relief. As they lay there, the world outside felt distant, insignificant. But Vasper's thoughts couldn't fully escape reality. "Don't think about what's on the news," he said, his tone serious. "I've accepted that Samara is as stubborn as Jake is with you. Forgive me for falling so deeply in love with you from the moment I saw you. My love was so overwhelming that I couldn't think of what I should do first. I fell for you so deeply that I lost sight of everything else. Every moment, all I ever think about is you. You're the only one I ever look for. It's all my fault that our relationship is in such chaos now because of Samara," he confessed, his voice raw with the honesty of his feelings. Vasper continued, the weight of his past heavy in his words. "I was used to getting what I wanted from women, and when I got bored, I would just leave without a word, without closure. But now, with Samara, I've met my match, someone who doesn't understand when it's over," he said, frustration evident in his tone. "I'm so sorry, Chanty," he pleaded, his tone laden with underlying emotion. Chanty listened quietly, feeling a pang of pain as Vasper spoke of his past, yet she understood that those times were behind them now. What mattered was the present, their relationship, and the love they shared. Vasper's fingers trailed tenderly over Chanty's lips, his touch sending a wave of warmth through her body. Her lips parted, welcoming his touch as his fingers delicately traced her lips, the simple gesture having a profound effect on Vasper. His embrace tightened around her, and he could no longer contain the desire that had been smoldering within him. One of Vasper's fingers was captured by Chanty's mouth, and she teased it with her tongue, her eyes never leaving his. The gesture was enough to ignite a burning desire within him, fueling his passion as he held her close even tighter. With a fervent kiss, filled with love and burning with intense longing, Vasper gripped the back of Chanty's head, kissing her with a fiery passion that consumed them both. They shared another deep, intoxicating kiss, their bodies growing hotter with each passing second. Chanty could feel the undeniable hardness of Vasper's arousal against her, and with a soft moan, she began to stroke him, her touch driving Vasper's body into a frenzy. His arms tightened around her as their kiss deepened, his hands sliding between her thighs, causing Chanty to arch her back and moan in pure pleasure. Their hands roamed each other's most delicate areas, their bodies lost in the sensations that overtook them. "Vasper, my body, it feels like it's about to explode," Chanty gasped, her voice trembling with the overwhelming pleasure coursing through her. Chanty rose slightly, her body moving in perfect rhythm with Vasper's, but their lips never parted. Vasper's deep groans mingled with Chanty's long, drawn-out moans as she straddled him, removing his hands, so she could grind against him with deliberate, measured movements. Their mouths hung open, gasping for air as their eyes burned with the shared pleasure of their union. Though they did not cross the final line, the sensation was enough to drive their bodies mad. As their breathing became more ragged, Chanty slowly, deliberately rubbed her sensitive flesh against Vasper's hardness, her arms wrapped around his neck while Vasper's arms encircled her waist. His mouth traveled from her lips to her neck, his tongue worshipping her skin as he made his way to her breasts, driving Chanty to the edge of desperation. Her movements became more frenzied, her moans grew louder, Vasper's name escaping her lips in a symphony of passion and need. Vasper held Chanty's hips, guiding her as her pace quickened, their motions growing more frantic, their cries of pleasure intensifying. "Vasper! I'm so close," Chanty panted, barely able to speak through the intensity of her breathing as Vasper's embrace tightened around her. Both of them were nearing the peak of their pleasure, teetering on the brink of climax. Vasper captured Chanty's lips in a fervent kiss, their bodies and lips locked together, guttural groans escaping from both of them. Then, it hit them simultaneously. Their bodies tensed together, their embrace and kiss deepening as Chanty's grinding became slower, more deliberate, and drawn out. She could feel Vasper's release, the warmth of his essence spreading around her sensitive flesh. For a few seconds, it felt as though time had stopped, their world paused in the moment of their shared ecstasy. Chanty finally stilled, her hips steadying as they both pulled away from the kiss, gasping for air, their bodies drained of energy. Their eyes met, both of them panting heavily, their mouths slightly open as they caught their breath. But Vasper's embrace didn't loosen, their bodies still pressed tightly together, both of them exhausted and spent. They looked at each other, intoxicated by the afterglow of their shared experience, needing a few seconds before their breathing gradually returned to normal. "I love you so much," Vasper whispered, his voice tender, his eyes filled with love. "I love you too, Vasper," Chanty replied, a soft smile on her lips. She glanced down at their position, and Vasper followed her gaze before looking back at her with a smile. "I almost wanted to go all the way, so close to giving in. I almost let you inside," Chanty whispered, a hint of embarrassment in her voice, admitting how close she had come to losing control in the heat of the moment. Vasper chuckled, his laughter making him look even more handsome in Chanty's eyes. His laugh was her weakness. She was mesmerized by him, by the sight of his tired yet satisfied face, his eyes heavy with exhaustion but more attractive than ever. "I know," Vasper replied, "I felt the same, Chanty. I wanted to have you completely, totally, but it's not time yet. But soon." "I can wait," Vasper said in a low, husky tone, before kissing her tenderly once more. "I want to sleep, my body feels so weak," Chanty admitted, but she also wanted Vasper to sleep, knowing how exhausted he was. Vasper smiled mischievously at her, reaching for his shirt discarded on the bedside table, and used it to wipe away the remnants of their passion. Chanty smiled back, watching Vasper's movements. She raised her hips to allow him to clean them properly, and when he was done, they laughed softly together as Vasper tossed the shirt into the laundry basket, making a perfect shot. Suddenly, he pulled Chanty back down onto the bed, hugging her tightly. "Let's sleep now, we can continue again when we wake up," Vasper murmured playfully, making them both laugh as Chanty playfully slapped his chest. He kissed her forehead, her nose, and then her lips, before they both closed their eyes, drifting off to sleep, Vasper falling asleep almost instantly, his exhaustion evident. Chanty, however, stayed awake a bit longer, her gaze lingering on Vasper's sleeping face. She admired the shape of his lips, tempted to bite them gently. She smiled to herself, wondering how many women had tasted those lips before. She understood why Samara couldn't bear to let Vasper go, but she knew she couldn't give him up either. Brenda had been right, Vasper was like the devil incarnate. From the moment she first saw his face, she couldn't get him out of her mind, not even in her dreams. It had been love at first sight, despite knowing he was her enemy. She gently placed her palm on Vasper's cheek, careful not to wake him. "Sorry, Samara, but I can't give him back to you," she whispered to herself bitterly, wondering what trials their love would face in the future. Vasper stirred slightly, murmuring softly in his sleep, tightening his hold on her, and Chanty smiled, hugging him back before closing her eyes, her final thoughts drifting to David. "Sorry, David, you'll have to handle things at the vineyard." "My apologies," she murmured, before finally allowing sleep to claim her. Chanty felt a soft kiss on her lips, slow and tender, with a hint of his tongue tasting her, as a deep groan rumbled in his throat. Her eyes fluttered open, and there he was, Vasper, smiling down at her as he kissed her. The late afternoon light bathed the room in a golden glow. It was past 4 p.m. "Let's watch the sunset on the other side of the island," Vasper murmured, his voice laced with a groan as his eyes met hers. Shanta's heart leaped at the thought, a smile spreading across her face as she gazed up at him. Vasper lay beside her on the bed, watching her intently. She was lying there, completely naked, while Vasper had already changed into a t-shirt and tropical shorts. His smile never wavered as his eyes roamed over her body, causing Shanty to laugh and quickly pull the blanket over herself, trying to cover up. She attempted to sit up, but Vasper playfully pushed her back down onto the bed, making them both laugh. She knew exactly what was going through his mind. Determined, she tried to get up again, holding the blanket tightly against her chest, but once more, Vasper gently pushed her back down. Their laughter echoed through the room as they playfully wrestled with each other. "Didn't I say we should continue where we left off?" Vasper teased. "Vasper, stop it. We can continue this later," Shanta laughed, pushing herself up on her arms to sit up once more. But Vasper, with a mischievous grin, suddenly pounced on her, pinning her down. Shanty shrieked with laughter, their playful banter filling the room. Vasper made a bold move to pull the blanket away, but Shanty resisted with all her strength. Their laughter grew louder as they tugged at the blanket until Vasper finally managed to yank it off and toss it to the foot of the bed. Shanta's body was fully exposed to Vasper's hungry gaze. His laughter died away, replaced by a deep, intense smile as his eyes roved over her with a look of intoxicated desire. Shanta's expression mirrored his as the temperature in the room seemed to rise. Vasper's gaze fixated on her breasts, and without hesitation, he took one into his mouth. Shanty gasped at the sudden sensation, her body responding immediately. Then Vasper captured her lips in a searing kiss, his hand gently cradling her cheek as they kissed deeply. "We'll be late for the sunset, it's almost time," Shanty whispered against his lips, her eyes locking with his. Vasper smiled apologetically. "Sorry, let's go," he replied, finally pulling away and standing up beside the bed. He extended his hand to help her up, but as soon as she stood, he pulled her into a tight embrace. "I love you," he whispered in her ear. Shanta smiled, responding with her own, "I love you too, Vasper," followed by a deep kiss. "Go ahead, I'll just get changed," Shanta said, and Vasper nodded, smiling before leaving the room. Shanty glanced at the time and realized she had just enough to take a quick shower. She hurried to freshen up, the scent of her shampoo and soap revitalizing her. Then after, stepping out of the bathroom with a towel wrapped around her body and another around her hair, she was cautious, knowing Jake could pop up unexpectedly like he always did, unbothered by trespassing into other people's rooms. Wrapped in her towel, she headed straight to her cabinet, changing into a two-piece bikini and slipping on a knitted dress over it, enhancing her already striking figure. She planned on having a night swim with Vasper before they returned to David's mansion. She was also curious about the results of David's meeting at the vineyards. Drying her hair quickly, she noticed a watch lying on the bed, a beautiful gold watch adorned with diamonds around the frame, though it had a crack. The chain was broken, a small, almost unnoticeable detail that still caught her eye. "I wonder why it broke. And why did the chain snap?" Shanty wondered to herself, thinking of how unfortunate it was for the watch to be damaged. But the diamond still sparkled, with a red diamond in the center, much like the one on her ring, though smaller. Admiring the design, it was unmistakably a man's watch, and she was certain it belonged to Vasper. Picking it up, she left the room, realizing she had never noticed Vasper wearing a watch before. Both of them weren't fond of wearing jewelry, unless it was for a special occasion. As she walked out to the living room, she spotted Vasper leaning against the doorframe, staring out at the sea. His smile broadened when he saw her. His gaze traveled from her face down to her toes, his admiration evident in his expression. Shanty approached him, and Vasper immediately wrapped her in a tight embrace, his hands firmly grasping her but as he squeezed playfully, followed by a passionate kiss. When their lips finally parted, Vasper looked at her with playful, mischievous eyes. "Should we head back to the room?" he suggested, his tone dripping with insinuation. Shanta laughed, playfully swatting at him, and they both chuckled, though Vasper kept his arm securely around her waist. "Soon, but for now, let's go," Chanty replied. But before they left, she held up the watch in front of Vasper's face. "You left this in the room. I only noticed it after I got dressed," Chanty said. But the look on Vasper's face suddenly turned deadly serious as he stared at the watch and then back at Chanty, his expression one of shock, as if he had seen a ghost. Chanty felt a chill of fear creep over her. "What's wrong? Is there a problem?" she asked, concerned. Vasper took the watch from her, his jaw clenched as he stared at it intensely. The tension in the air was palpable, the room that had been filled with warmth and laughter now thick with unease. The watch, with its cracked face and broken chain, seemed to hold a story, a secret that had just surfaced, casting a shadow over their moment of intimacy. "Why did it break and snap?" Chanty asked softly, her fingers gently caressing the broken watch frame and the snapped chains. Vasper looked at her with a serious expression. "It fell on the cement and got run over by my car. I didn't notice it right away, which is why it ended up like this," Vasper explained. But he was lying. He didn't want to tell Chanty that the watch came from the place where he and Jake had fought. He was sure that Jake had returned the watch. But how did Jake survive on that island? He was wearing a suspended bracelet, had no powers, and no access to water. Could someone have rescued Jake? But even if someone had, how could Jake teleport near Chanty when the suspended bracelet had not yet expired? It would take 3 days for it to be removed from Jake's hand. That meant Jake's teleportation power wouldn't return for 3 days, so how had his watch already returned? Who helped Jake? And if there was another being with teleportation powers who brought the watch to him, who could it be? These thoughts raced through Vasper's mind. Moreover, why was the watch placed in Chanty's room? Only Jake could have done that. Vasper grew serious, realizing he couldn't afford to be complacent. He knew Jake would seek revenge for what he had done, but he didn't want Chanty to find out about what had happened between him and Jake. He had no plans of telling her. Then, as if snapping out of it, he looked at Chanty, his expression relaxing back into a casual smile. "I thought I lost this watch, but it turns out it was just left behind," Vasper said nonchalantly, though their eye contact lingered a bit too long. He glanced around the room, then took Chanty's hand and led her back toward the bedroom. "Vasper, we have somewhere to be." "We can go back later," Chanty protested, pouting slightly. She really wanted to catch the sunset at that hour. But she followed him anyway, allowing herself to be led back. Vasper turned to her with a laugh, scooping her up into his arms. All right," he said with a grin. And just like that, their surroundings changed. They had teleported to the other side of the island. Chanty gasped at the breathtaking view around her as Vasper gently set her down, his arms still wrapped around her waist. The sun was just about to set, casting a magical orange hue across the sky and the vast expanse of the sea. The large rocks in the distance, with waves crashing against them, created a mesmerizing scene. There was even a large rock in the water, with small trees and plants growing on it, looking like a miniature island. But Vasper's eyes were on Chanty, captivated by the wonder in her face as she admired the beauty of their surroundings. Their eyes met, and Vasper pulled her into a tight embrace, kissing her deeply, passionately, their hearts pouring into the kiss. "It's so beautiful," Chanty whispered as their lips parted. Vasper smiled at her. "Yes, it's breathtaking," he replied, but his eyes were still fixed on her, and Chanty knew he was referring to her, not the scenery, judging by the look on his face. She smiled back at him. As the sky brightened with shades of orange from the setting sun, the atmosphere felt almost magical. Chanty clung tightly to Vasper as they watched the sun dip below the horizon, the vastness of the ocean stretching out before them. The moment was incredibly romantic, amplified by the strong love they felt for each other. Vasper then turned her body to face him, kissing her with even more intensity, a French kiss that ignited her senses. His hands roamed beneath her knitted dress, sliding towards the strings of her bikini, untying them at her sides. The fabric fell to her feet, landing softly on the sand as their kiss deepened. The sun had finally set, but the heat between them was just beginning to rise. Chanty's arms were wrapped around Vasper's neck as he gently laid her down on the soft sand. Vasper knelt between her legs, spreading them wide in front of him, causing Chanty to gasp as her heartbeat quickened in anticipation. The warmth of Vasper's hand on her sensitive flesh sent shivers down her spine, her muscles tensing as a fire spread through her veins, eliciting a deep moan as her body arched. Vasper's fingers moved with tenderness, teasing her inner thighs, his other hand caressing her breast as he watched the reactions play across her face. When he quickened the pace of his fingers, Chanty's body writhed on the sand, her hands clutching the grains as her cries of pleasure grew louder, Vasper's name escaping her lips in deep, guttural moans. The pleasure built within her, her breath coming in gasps as she chased the sensation. Finally, Vasper couldn't resist any longer. He lowered his head, tasting her, devouring her with his mouth, his tongue exploring her wetness. The heat of his mouth and tongue only intensified Chanty's pleasure, her body moving frantically beneath him. Her hands gripped Vasper's hair tightly as she watched him with half-lidded eyes, biting her lip. Vasper spread her thighs wider, not satisfied yet, wanting more. Chanty's head fell back onto the sand, her body arching as she moaned his name, the sound a mix of desperation and ecstasy. She was nearing her climax, and Vasper knew it. Chanty's breath came in short, rapid gasps as she teetered on the edge, and then, she reached it. Vasper's tongue held steady, pressing firmly against her as her muscles tensed around him. Chanty let out a deep, prolonged moan as her legs shook in Vasper's grasp, her hands falling weakly into the sand. Her chest heaved with each breath, her body quivering from the intensity of her release. Vasper gently licked up every bit of Chanty's essence, his tongue meticulously cleaning her sensitive flesh. Each deliberate movement sent shivers through Chanty's body, but she let him continue, too spent to protest. The night had grown dark, but there was still a faint light in the sky. Vasper crawled up Chanty's body, kissing her passionately once more. Vasper's hands found the bikini he had earlier removed from Chanty. "I love you, Chanty," Vasper whispered against her lips. "I love you too, Vasper," Chanty replied softly, her right hand gently caressing his cheek. Vasper smiled as he embraced her. They teleported back to their home, the area outside their house illuminated by the surrounding lights. Vasper, still smiling, looked at Chanty's face. "Let's have dinner outside tonight." "We'll go back to David's tomorrow," Vasper said. Chanty nodded in agreement. Vasper helped her stand and gently dressed her, sliding her bikini back up her thighs. They set up a table outside on the sand, just far enough that the waves wouldn't reach the legs of the table. Vasper arranged some lights to softly illuminate their spot, creating a dim and romantic ambience. He used his teleportation power to retrieve special dishes from a restaurant, but he drove Chanty to the restaurant in his sports car, not wanting to leave her alone at home, just in case Jake suddenly appeared again. Vasper was always on guard, prepared for whatever revenge Jake might plan if it was true that Jake had survived the island. But Vasper was curious, how had Jake managed to remove the suspended bracelet? Only a high-ranking officer from the inner world, using black crystals, could have done it. Yet, Jake hadn't shown himself to Vasper since then, leaving Vasper to wonder. He was sure that Jake's powers had grown stronger after surviving such a life-threatening ordeal on the island. From the beach, they teleported to Vasper's red sports car, landed softly on the passenger seat, with Chanty ending up on Vasper's lap. The tight space made their landing awkward yet intimate, causing Chanty to laugh softly, and Vasper joined in, though he secretly enjoyed their position. Chanty remained on his lap, and Vasper, holding her tightly, gently cupped her cheek, bringing their lips together for a kiss. The kiss deepened as Vasper's hand began to roam over Chanty's body. Chanty, still smiling, pulled away slightly from the kiss. "Don't we have somewhere to be?" Chanty asked, glancing outside the garage. She noticed the vast parking area filled with lined-up sports cars and various other vehicles. Her curiosity piqued as she surveyed the surroundings. Vasper, observing her interest, smiled. "Where are we?" she asked. "We're at my mansion," Vasper replied, his voice low and husky. Chanty's eyes widened as she looked at Vasper. "Didn't you say you didn't want to bring me here because you didn't like this mansion?" she teased lightly. Vasper chuckled softly. "Yes, but I had no choice. I parked my car here, and this is where we're starting our journey to the restaurant. I couldn't leave you on the island, especially if Jake decided to show up unexpectedly. "Okay, so, get in the driver's seat," Chanty said as she opened the door, but Vasper stopped her, holding her close again and showering her with kisses on her lips and neck. When he reached her neck, Chanty gently pushed his head back. "Vasper, look," Chanty said, directing his gaze to the front. There, Khalid stood, surveying the area with suspicion, likely due to the noise, but he couldn't see inside the car because of the tinted windows. Vasper smiled, giving Chanty one last kiss on the lips before opening the door. Chanty got out first, followed by Vasper, and Khalid noticed them, immediately showing deep respect as he bowed to both Vasper and Chanty. "Come inside," Vasper said to Chanty, but she hesitated slightly, knowing that this was the same mansion where Vasper had brought Samara before. She was also worried about being seen by Vasper's other servants. But Vasper gently pulled her along. "We're already here, and I want you to see the inside," he said. Chanty followed Vasper's lead, feeling a bit self-conscious about her beach attire and flip-flops. "Vasper, I'm still in my beach clothes. It's embarrassing if they see me like this," she said, her voice tinged with shyness. Vasper just smiled as he looked at her. "You're gorgeous," he said, making Chanty blush, her face turning red with embarrassment under his gaze. They walked towards the massive entrance door, and Khalid, who had noticed Chanty's beauty despite not speaking, seemed mesmerized. "Good evening, Your Highness," Khalid greeted, his voice filled with respect, though his eyes were full of admiration for Chanty. Vasper noticed Khalid's reaction and smiled. Khalid opened the door for them, and as they entered, Vasper's many servants lined the hallway. Chanty was surprised by the scene, realizing how princely Vasper appeared in his mansion, a stark contrast to when they were alone. The servants bowed their heads but couldn't resist sneaking glances at them, especially at Chanty. They were awestruck by her, dressed simply in beachwear and flip-flops, yet exuding an allure unmatched by any of the other women Vasper had brought to the mansion. Their eyes followed Chanty, their mouths slightly open in amazement as they took in her beauty from head to toe. Chanty, in turn, was amazed by the interior of the mansion. It was vast, almost palace-like in size, even larger than the mansions of David, Jake, and Jacob. She wasn't sure about Jacob's mansion yet. The luxurious dining table could seat 12 people, the living room was fit for royalty, the design was exquisite, and there were many hallways leading to places she couldn't even guess. Vasper watched her with a happy smile. "This is my home. I lived here with my mother when she was still alive, but after she passed, things changed," Vasper explained. "This is the place where I used to bring all the women from before." He trailed off, looking slightly embarrassed by what he was saying. Chanty noticed the servants still lined up and staring at her. Vasper then turned to them. "All right, you can all leave now," he said. "Khalid, we won't be dining here, so don't serve any food." Khalid nodded and the servants dispersed. Chanty overheard some of them whispering that she was the most beautiful woman their master had ever brought to the mansion. The positive feedback made her happy. Her eyes then wandered to the grand staircase with a red carpet leading upstairs. She felt like she was in the house of a king. She looked at Vasper, wondering if this was the same man who cooked her breakfast, made her coffee, helped her with the laundry, and cooked meals for her. She admired how simple Vasper was despite his princely lifestyle. After all, he was the son of Alexander Mondragon, a prince of their kingdom and heir to the throne. Chanty continued to be in awe of her surroundings. "Come upstairs, a quick tour," Vasper said, leading her to the staircase. But just as Chanty was about to follow, Vasper suddenly disappeared from the bottom of the stairs and reappeared at the top, smiling down at her with his hands extended, inviting her to come up. Chanty laughed at Vasper's playful antics and started ascending the stairs, feeling like a queen as she climbed. Vasper, overwhelmed with happiness, felt as though his dream had come true, as if Chanty was already his wife, his queen in his mansion. When Chanty reached the top, Vasper took her hand, and he carried her into his room. Chanty marveled at the size of the second floor, noticing 5 large doors along the corridor. But the room they entered was the largest of them all. Inside, Chanty was amazed by the huge paintings of Vasper's face and a portrait of an incredibly beautiful woman. Chanty's eyes wandered around the room, recalling that these were the paintings she had heard Samara and Laika talk about at the vineyard. More paintings caught her attention, but what stood out the most was the grand bed in the center, designed fit for a king. Goosebumps ran down Shanta's arms as she wondered how many women had been brought to this bed by Vasper. Did Samara sleep here as well? A feeling of discomfort washed over Shanty as she stared at the bed, unable to imagine what Vasper might have done with other women on it. Vasper's expression softened as he seemed to understand Shanta's feelings. "I'm sorry," Vasper said, pulling her into an embrace. "Are you mad that I brought you here?" he asked. Shanta looked up at Vasper. "No," she replied, though she couldn't hide her discomfort. "I just can't imagine what you did on that bed," Shanty whispered. Vasper's face tightened with a pained smile as memories of his wild past flashed before him. He remembered times when there were even 2 women on that bed. He hugged Shanta tightly and teleported them back to the car, landing together in the passenger seat. Vasper embraced Shanty once more and kissed her. "I'm so sorry," he murmured. Shanta smiled. "It's okay, Vasper," she reassured him. Vasper then moved to the driver's seat, buckled Shanta's seatbelt, and gave her another kiss before starting the car. They slowly drove out of the garage, which automatically opened as they approached. Shanty, amused, watched the collection of cars Vasper left behind in the rearview mirror. "You love collecting sports cars?" Shanty asked as Vasper drove onto the road. Vasper smiled and nodded, but at that moment, nothing made him happier than having Shanty in the passenger seat of his favorite sports car. He felt like he was on cloud 9, more than satisfied. One of his hands was on the steering wheel, while the other rested on Shanta's inner thigh. She didn't mind letting Vasper's hand remain there. She leaned back, enjoying the scenery outside the window. She was fascinated by the places they passed. When they arrived at the restaurant, Vasper got out first, but not before they shared another kiss. "Wait here, I'll be quick," he said. Shanta nodded, and Vasper exited the car, leaving the air conditioning on and the engine running. He moved with swift precision as he left, collecting their order while Shanty waited in his sports car. It only took seconds. Then, from the restaurant, just a few kilometers down the road, they teleported back to the island, Vasper's sports car parked behind their house. Shanty admired the setup Vasper had created, following his lead. After they had everything ready, they sat down to eat in front of the beach. Their conversation was casual, their laughter filling the air occasionally. The atmosphere around them was sweet and romantic, accompanied by the sound of the waves lapping against the shore and the nocturnal creatures of the night. They temporarily forgot the problems awaiting them in the future, knowing they still had many trials to overcome in life. But they also knew that as long as they faced them together, nothing was impossible, and their love would only grow stronger. Vasper poured Shanty a glass of red wine, just a small amount. Shanty respected that, sipping only what she could handle. When she started to feel a little dizzy, she stopped drinking. They toasted to their wine with smiles, and Vasper's eyes never left Shanta's face as they drank. They sat outside for a long time, their feet just touching the water's edge as they drank their wine. Shanty nestled between Vasper's legs, leaning against his body, both of them facing the sea. Vasper's arms wrapped tightly around Shanty, his lips pressed against her shoulder, kissing her. Sometimes, his lips would find her neck, and occasionally, their mouths would meet in long, lingering kisses. Endless "I love yous" whispered between them. Vasper held Shanta tightly as they kissed, her face tilted to the side to look at him. But Vasper's hands had already found their way inside Shanta's dress, between her thighs, beneath her bikini. One hand rested on her breast, and within minutes, Vasper had brought Shanta to the peak of ecstasy again, using only his hands and fingers, accompanied by their heated kisses. Shanta's moans mixed with the sound of the waves crashing on the shore. And afterward, Shanty was left panting, with no end to Vasper's declarations of love as he hugged her tightly. His intense gaze locked onto Shanty as she turned slightly, her body half facing him. Their eyes met, engaging in a silent, powerful exchange. Vasper waited, his focus unwavering, anticipating the words she was about to speak. Finally, Shanty broke the tension, her voice tinged with concern. "The reporter mentioned they saw you with someone younger than Samara on an island. What should I make of that? I'm worried someone might have seen us here. Do you remember that yacht that got too close to the island?" Her words stirred something in Vasper, a memory he had almost let slip away. The air between them thickened as Vasper's expression hardened, doubts creeping into his mind. But instead of letting them fester, he pulled Chanty into a firm embrace. "Don't worry," he said, his voice rich with sincerity. "I'm ready to face the media. I'll take the blame for everything, as long as your name stays out of it." His words were resolute, his eyes filled with a deep, unyielding sincerity. Shanta looked deeply into his eyes, questioning if he truly understood the storm that could be unleashed. She didn't want her life entangled with the chaos of media scrutiny. Vasper, sensing her hesitation, leaned in and pressed a long, tender kiss to her lips. "I'm so sorry for dragging you into my chaotic life," he whispered, the regret evident in his tone. "If it were up to me, I would never let Samara set foot in your vineyard," he added, his voice growing stern, a reflection of his inner turmoil. Chanty, her voice steady yet laden with the weight of her responsibilities, replied, "The well-being of many is more important than my personal reasons, Vasper. You've seen the changes brought by this business partnership. It's going to help so many families in our area, creating opportunities that could change lives. It would be selfish to turn down this opportunity that the vineyard has worked so hard for, the international recognition of our products. So many scholarships will be funded for the youth. I can't stop what my father started, not just for personal reasons." Her words were firm, her expression reflecting the gravity of her decision. Vasper felt the heaviness of her words, understanding the immense burden she carried. However, Shanta's face darkened as she continued, "But what Leica did, burning the vineyard, has severely impacted our production, Vasper. If she does it again, I will never forgive her. The funding for the scholarship program depends on our production. These scholarships are essential for the youth in our area who want to finish their education. Jasmine was able to complete her studies, even going abroad, because my father sponsored her. It breaks my heart to know the damage that fire caused." Vasper, now fully grasping the depth of the destruction Leica's actions had caused, felt a heavy burden on his conscience. He knew that Leica's retaliation stemmed from her anger toward him, anger fueled by his relationship with Chanty. "Leica knows it would hurt me more if you were the one she targeted," Vasper said, his voice thick with emotion. "Chanty, I love you so much. I'm so sorry," he whispered against her lips, his voice trembling as their connection deepened, the kiss lingering, intense and full of unspoken emotions. "Would you accept a donation for the scholarship program?" Vasper asked earnestly, his gaze intense. Shanta smiled softly and nodded. "Yes," she replied, and Vasper responded with another kiss, a gesture that conveyed both his love and his relief. "I'll be going to Jasmine's house for her farewell party on the 26th, Shanta said, breaking the moment. "You can't come with me." Vasper's expression faltered, his unease clearly visible. "Only the guardians are allowed, depending on who's available. I've noticed they've been unusually busy lately, handling so many responsibilities," she added. Vasper couldn't hide his discomfort. "I can't relax when you're not by my side," he admitted, his voice tinged with worry. "Vasper, we're not married yet, but we're already acting like we are. We're always together, you have no limits when it comes to me." She paused, a playful smile touching her lips, "Except for one thing," she added teasingly. "And don't worry, there are 6 guardians watching over me, Vasper. They've been protecting me long before we met," she added, and Vasper just nodded, but his anxiety lingered, especially because of Jacob, and Raphael. The jealousy he felt toward the men who had feelings for Shanta never truly disappeared. In response, Shanta kissed Vasper passionately, but his return kiss was even more intense, demanding and fervent. Their lips stayed connected, and Shanta leaned into him, their bodies melding as they faced the sea. Vasper wrapped his arms tightly around her as the wind grew colder. "I'm planning to buy a yacht," Vasper suddenly said, breaking the silence. Shanta looked at him, her thoughts drifting to Jake's yacht that had been destroyed in the fight between Vasper, and Jacob. She didn't reply, knowing that Vasper could buy anything he desired. Vasper kissed her neck, his voice softening as he murmured, "I love you, Chanty." "I love you too, Vasper," Chanty replied, her voice warm and filled with love as she returned his declaration. Shanta's plan for a night swim didn't happen, but sitting there with Vasper, facing the sea under the night sky, filled their hearts with joy. The love they shared was enough for them, the hours passing by with nothing but embraces and endless kisses. In the late evening, returning to their usual routine, Vasper once again used his teleportation power to bring the bed to the seaside. The weather was perfect, and they planned to sleep there, just like before, to witness the sunrise. Meanwhile, Chanty was in the bathroom, washing off the sand that clung to her body from their time sitting on the beach. As she glanced at the clock, she noticed it was already past 9 p.m. Time seemed to fly when she was with Vasper. When she stepped out of the bathroom, the bed was no longer there. She smiled, knowing exactly where Vasper had taken it. It was exactly what she wanted, nothing better than a good night's sleep wrapped tightly in Vasper's embrace under the thick comforter, especially with the cold breeze blowing. She dressed in black lingerie and an oversized black shirt that only covered half of her thighs. After changing, she left the room and peeked out from the living room towards the beach. There was Vasper, standing by the bed and watching her, grinning widely. She smiled back, signaling him to wait as she went to grab some water. Vasper nodded, and Chanty headed to the kitchen to retrieve a water bottle from the fridge. She grabbed a 1-liter bottle, but as she closed the fridge and turned around, she found Jake standing right in front of her, no space between them. The sudden appearance sent a shiver down her spine, and Chanty screamed, "Oh my God!" But before she could react further, Jake wrapped his arms around her, causing her to drop the water bottle. Simultaneously, they both disappeared from the kitchen. Vasper, who heard Chanty's scream, immediately teleported back to the kitchen. But when he arrived, Chanty was gone, with only the water bottle left on the floor. Panic set in as Vasper frantically searched the entire house, inside and out, calling out Chanty's name, but she was nowhere to be found. His emotions were a whirlwind: worry, fear for Chanty's safety, and a deep, burning anger. He strongly suspected Jake had taken her, and in his rage, he shouted Jake's name repeatedly, his voice growing hoarse from the effort. In his fury, he forgot to return the bed to the bedroom and teleported directly to David's place. When Vasper arrived in David's living room, everyone was shocked. All the guardians were present, and Jake stood by David's large TV. Chanty was also there, standing next to David, but she was crying. The moment Chanty saw Vasper, she ran to him, wrapping her arms around him tightly. They embraced each other with intensity, though Chanty continued to cry silently. Vasper looked at Chanty's face, kissing her repeatedly out of concern. While wiping her tears, the guardians watched them, feeling the weight of the situation. They could see the depth of Vasper and Chanty's love for each other, emotions so profound that words couldn't describe them. But Jake stood there, glaring at Vasper with intense anger, his face reflecting the pain and fury he felt as he watched the two of them together. The raw emotion Chanty displayed for Vasper was like a knife to Jake's heart. Jacob remained silent, observing the scene with a stern expression. David stood with one hand on the wall and the other on his hip, head bowed, waiting for the scene between Vasper and Chanty to end. Despite wearing just an oversized t-shirt, Chanty's allure was undeniable, her long legs visible, and her perfect-shaped body evident even beneath the loose shirt. She wasn't wearing a bra, making her breasts subtly visible under the shirt. Lorena arrived, carrying a bathrobe for Chanty. Chanty took it, and with Vasper's help, she put it on. "Thank you, Lorena," Chanty said. Lorena nodded and quietly left for her room, but Chanty still didn't let go of Vasper, nor did Vasper release his hold on her. Vasper then turned his gaze to Jake, confirming his suspicions that Jake was still alive. Jake responded with a sardonic smile. "Vasper, what's the matter?" Jake asked mockingly. "You didn't believe I'd survive after you left me on that island?" Jake continued, and by then, David was fully aware of what had happened between Jake and Vasper. Vasper looked at the faces of the guardians, then back at Chanty. However, Chanty's face was filled with fear and concern. "Jake, whatever issues you have with Vasper, can you please keep them between the two of you? Don't bring them into my home. When you're in my house, show at least a little respect to me, the guardians, and Chanty." "That's my only concern," David said with a serious and authoritative tone. Lewis nodded in agreement, his face equally serious. "If you want to settle things, do it somewhere else where my property won't be damaged." As you can see, it's not even fully repaired yet, and I don't want any trouble over your personal issues, David added. David, why did you have Jake take me when I was planning to go back anyway? Vasper was already with me. And Jake, please, Shanta said, turning to face Jake, show some respect. I don't want you just showing up unannounced, especially not in my room or anywhere else. Show a little decency. Her words cut through Jake like a dagger, causing him immense pain. Jake looked at Shanta seriously, but there was a gentleness in his gaze. Vasper, however, was deadly serious, struggling to contain his anger and emotions in front of David. Shanty, I'm sorry. We've been looking for you all night because I have to leave early tomorrow. I'll be gone for about a week to attend to some matters in the inner world. I've been summoned by the officials because of Jake. They need a formal report that he's no longer part of our group, David explained, shocking Shanty with this new information. Jake didn't look at David, his eyes remained fixed on Shanty, while Vasper clenched his jaw, barely holding back his rage. Jacob noticed the tension in the room. He was impressed by Jake's audacity. Jacob shook his head in disbelief as he watched Jake, amazed at how little Jake cared that Shanty was standing right beside her boyfriend, Vasper. Shanty, the reason I asked Jake to retrieve you was so we could discuss the situation and set things up for your return. I didn't expect Jake to just take you like that without even informing Vasper, David continued, his eyes now on Jake, his tone one of mild rebuke. David felt a growing sense of danger from Jake, noticing how much stronger his aura had become. There was no doubt that Jake had grown more powerful. Shanty, Prince Raphael left something for you. I had it placed in your room, David said. I'm sorry, but out of respect, I had to accept it. You know it would have been disrespectful to refuse his gift, David added, making Vasper clench his jaw in frustration. The guardians exchanged looks, some even chuckling at Vasper and Shanta's situation. Shanty had so many suitors, yet she remained silent, holding on to Vasper. Jake, however, turned away, his jaw clenched tightly. Justin and Marco will be guarding you for now, Shanty. You can stay at the island with Vasper. Just take Justin, Gabriel, and Louis with you. Jacob will accompany me on my trip, David said. Shanty felt a surge of happiness at the thought of staying on the island with Vasper. But Jake's displeasure at David's decision was evident in his expression. When you return, I want to discuss rebuilding my mansion. I'm tired of moving from place to place. I need my own home, Shanta said. David understood her request and nodded. Vasper squeezed Shanta's hand in delight, they had discussed this plan before. Vasper lifted Shanta's chin, their eyes met, and he kissed her passionately, causing the guardians to look away in discomfort. But Jake's gaze remained sharp, full of jealousy, even though he had no right to feel that way. Louis watched Jake, frowning at him, impressed by Jake's audacity. He had never seen anyone like Jake before, a man so dangerously in love, even when there was no hope, yet still unwilling to surrender. This was on Louis's mind, and Gabriel and Justin were thinking the same thing as they exchanged glances, all keeping a close eye on Jake. They still couldn't believe what had happened between Jake and Vasper on the island. Jake had survived, and that survival had only made him stronger. For the Guardians, every life-threatening situation they survived only enhanced their abilities and power, making them stronger than ever. Shanty, tomorrow when we leave, the papers are on my office desk. You can check them regarding our meeting about the vineyard, David said. It's late to discuss everything now, but I placed everything on the office table for you to review, he added. Shanty nodded in agreement. Thank you, David. I really appreciate your effort, and I'm sorry for everything, she said, her voice and eyes filled with sadness. It's no problem, Shanty. I understand your situation, David replied, reassuring her. Meanwhile, Vasper kept a close watch on Jake and Jacob's movements. Jacob was aware of Vasper's keen observation but made sure to show respect for Vasper and Shanta's relationship. Jacob was grateful that Shanty had recovered from the issue involving Samara. David then urged her. Shanty, you can sleep in your room now, it's getting late. And I'm sorry for what happened, Shanty. I'm sorry too, Vasper, David said, glancing at Vasper before briefly looking at Jake. But Jake seemed to hiss with a sarcastic laugh. "David, can you stop apologizing if it's not your fault? What are you, a saint?" Jake suddenly interjected, drawing everyone's attention to him. Justin could only shake his head as he watched Jake. However, Chanty was surprised by Jake's sharp words, especially directed at David. She hadn't expected Jake to be so blunt, particularly with David. Perhaps it was because he no longer felt obligated to David, making him more forthright in speaking his mind, regardless of who might get hurt. Vasper merely glared at Jake, trying his best to control his anger out of respect for David and the others. Chanty then looked at Vasper. "Come on, I want to sleep on the island," she said, turning to David. "I'll come back here tomorrow before you leave, David." "What time are you leaving?" Chanty asked. "We'll be leaving before sunrise, Chanty. Jake will take us to the inner world. He needs to come with us to explain himself," David replied, his gaze lingering meaningfully on Jake. Chanty didn't look at Jake anymore. The Guardians chuckled at the thought of what Jake might say to justify leaving their brotherhood. Would he have the courage to admit it was because of Chanty? That wouldn't be a valid reason. Jake would need to come up with a deeper explanation. Otherwise, he would have to go through many challenging processes in the inner world, both physically and mentally. The Guardians were well aware of these trials. Jake no longer looked at David, a deadly serious expression replaced his usual demeanor. "This is the most senseless decision Jake has made in his life," Justin thought, and Jake heard it, causing him to look sternly at Justin. Justin just stared back at him. "You're an idiot, Jake," Justin said to Jake, but telepathically, and Jake glared at Justin. Jacob noticed the exchange between their eyes. He knew about Justin and Jake's telepathic abilities, but only Jake could read Justin's thoughts, while Justin couldn't read Jake's mind. "All right, I'll come back early tomorrow, David," Chanty said in motion for Vasper to follow her, but Justin interrupted. "Chanty, aren't you going to check Raphael's gift? We brought so much into your room earlier, you could start a flower shop," Justin said, but Chanty showed no interest. She excused herself from David and pulled Vasper along with her, the Guardians watching them as Jake's gaze still bore into Vasper. Chanty knocked on Lorena's door. When she checked the hallway clock, it was already past 10 p.m. Lorena answered the door with a smile, her eyes questioning. "Miss Chanty," Lorena began, but Chanty told her to move all of Raphael's gifts from her room to Lorena's. Lorena was shocked by what she heard, as were the Guardians. Jake remained deadly serious. Marco chuckled as he looked at Justin, knowing they had both carried Raphael's gifts, which included not just flowers but also 3 different kinds of branded bags, not to mention the chocolates. "Lorena, you're so lucky," Justin said. Vasper merely smiled as he watched Lorena's eyes light up. "Miss Chanty, have you seen Prince Raphael's gifts?" Lorena asked. "Not yet, but I'm not interested in seeing them. Please take everything out of my room, Lorena, so it's gone by the time I return tomorrow." "And thanks in advance," Chanty replied, glancing at Vasper as she invited him to the island, saying she was tired. Vasper nodded, and suddenly they disappeared from Lorena's sight. Lorena remained in shock, unable to believe what Chanty had said. She hurried to Chanty's room and gasped, her hands covering her mouth as she opened the luxurious branded bag box. When she opened it, she was mesmerized by the bag inside. She felt like she was dreaming. She hadn't even counted the bouquets of flowers lined up against the cabinets or the bouquets of chocolates. One by one, she took out Raphael's gifts and moved them to her room. The size of the flower bouquets made it hard for her to carry them all. "Prince Raphael is so generous. This is only his first gift, and it's already branded bags, 3 kinds, no less," Lorena thought. "Chanty is so lucky, but Raphael is unlucky. Lorena is luckier." Lorena laughed at her thoughts. "Thank you for all of this, Prince Raphael and Miss Chanty," Lorena said to herself. Jake saw her struggling to carry everything, so he helped her. Jake teleported everything to Lorena's room, and she thanked him. Jake just nodded and then disappeared from Lorena's sight. The waves crashed rhythmically against the shore, a soothing backdrop to the passionate embrace between Vasper and Chanty. Vasper lay beside her on the bed he had set up near the shore. Beneath the thick comforter, she was tightly wrapped in Vasper's embrace. Its warmth a sharp contrast to the cool night air. Vasper he wore only shorts, his bare chest radiating warmth, offering her a sense of security that eased the fear and worry left by Jake's recent actions, his bare chest rising and falling with steady breaths, radiating heat that wrapped around her like a protective cocoon. Vasper's lips remained close to Shanta's forehead, occasionally brushing down to her lips, each kiss lingering as if there was no end, accompanied by murmured declarations of their love. His kisses were slow, deliberate, as if each one was a vow, a promise whispered against her skin. "Is what Jake said earlier true?" Chanty asked, her voice hesitant, almost a whisper, avoiding Vasper's eyes. Fear of the possibilities gripped her, and Vasper's silence stretched for several long seconds. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fears. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath as Vasper remained silent, the seconds stretching into eternity, which Chanty interpreted as confirmation. Her grip around Vasper tightened, and in response, he held her even closer. Finally, he exhaled, his arms tightening around her as if he could shield her from the truth. "I love you, Chanty. I don't want to lose you," Vasper finally said, his voice thick with emotion. He confessed, his voice a mix of determination and vulnerability. The raw emotion in his words struck Chanty deep, her own heart aching with the weight of their impossible situation. Chanty felt a deep sorrow, for she wanted the same, but the thought of losing Vasper in a battle between him and Jake was unbearable. How could she survive in a world without him? Tears began to well up in her eyes, the dam of her emotions threatening to break, which she tried to hold back, but they fell nonetheless as she buried her face in Vasper's chest. Her grip on him tightened, as if by holding him closer she could keep the darkness at bay. Vasper couldn't ignore the soft sobs escaping from her. He loosened his embrace slightly, creating some space between them, just enough to tilt her chin upward, forcing her to meet his gaze. He looked into her tear-filled eyes, only to see his own tears mirrored in hers. Vasper was silently crying. The sight of him, always so strong, now on the verge of breaking, sent a fresh wave of tears streaming down Shanta's cheeks. Shanta's mouth parted in surprise as she stared at him. Why was he crying? Vasper gently wiped away her tears with his hand, his touch tender, almost reverent. And Shanta did the same for him. Why? Chanty asked, her voice trembling. She tried to smile, forcing herself to control her emotions, a fragile attempt to mask the storm raging inside her. Vasper laughed softly, his eyes betraying the effort he was making to hold back his own feelings. His soft laugh was tinged with sadness, his tears finally spilling over. "Maybe because I love you so much, Chanty. I can't stand the thought of losing you. Just imagining it, I can't bear it," Vasper admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, but loaded with emotion. His voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. They were both thinking the same thing. They were both teetering on the edge, their love a fragile thread binding them to each other, yet strained under the pressure of everything trying to tear them apart. "Earlier, in the kitchen, when I realized you were gone, I couldn't understand what I was feeling. I'm just glad you were with David. Please, never take off this ring, okay? It's how I can find you, no matter where you go," Vasper said, his voice thick with emotion as he brought her left hand to his lips, kissing the spot where the red diamond ring, embedded with a tracking device, rested. The ring was not just a symbol of their bond, but also his lifeline to her, his way of ensuring she would never be out of his reach. Shanta nodded, and their lips met again, sharing a kiss full of love, a kiss that spoke of unspoken promises. It was not just a kiss but a merging of souls, a connection that transcended words, and feelings that others might find impossible, dangerous, or even crazy. But for Chanty and Vasper, their love was their life, their happiness, as essential as the air they breathed. They were each other's existence and reason for being. How long could they endure the complexity of their relationship when so many others around them desired to take their love and claim them for themselves? "I love you so much, Chanty. My life is nothing without you," Vasper whispered, his voice sultry as he gazed into her eyes, his fingers brushing against her lips before tracing the outline of her cheek. The weight of his words settled between them, a truth they both felt in the very marrow of their bones. You are my life, my happiness. Without you, my life has no meaning. His voice was soft but heavy with emotion as he laid bare his feelings before Chanty. She felt the same for him. Chanty held Vasper's hand against her cheek, closing her eyes to savor the warmth of his palm and the love it conveyed, the warmth of his hand against her skin, the love in his touch as palpable as the ocean breeze. Vasper captured her lips once more, and they kissed endlessly, as if time itself had stopped, as if the world outside their embrace no longer existed. Once more, they surrendered to the heat of their passion. Their bodies began to respond to the heat of their emotions. The sound of the waves faded, replaced by the soft, shared moans as Vasper's warm body pressed against hers. Chanty's soft but deep moans escaped her lips, his love for her radiating through every touch. But he silenced her moans with kisses, nearly stealing her breath with each one. Vasper, above her, struggled to catch his breath, overwhelmed by the ecstasy his body craved. Though he didn't fully enter her, the slow, gentle rubbing against her sensitive flesh still brought them both to the peak of pleasure. They were lost in their own world, their bodies responding to each other's every movement, each resisting the urge to go further and break Chanty's virginity. The slow, deliberate movements against her sensitive flesh ignited a fire between them, their passion building with every brush of skin. He fought to maintain control. Though he didn't fully enter her, the slow, teasing friction between them was enough to drive them both to the brink. Vasper felt like he was walking on hot coals, the struggle to hold back almost too much to bear, especially as Chanty's body began to move with a desperation that matched his own. Chanty's hips moved to meet Vasper's slow thrusts, her breathing coming in quick, shallow gasps as she teetered on the edge of desire, her body aching for more. Vasper's own breath quickened, his eyes intoxicated with the sight of her beneath him, struggling to maintain his self-control, his eyes dark with the effort it took not to lose himself completely. "Chanty, please, don't move like that. I swear, I might lose control and enter you," Vasper warned, his voice hoarse as if he were climbing a steep hill, strained as if he were holding on to his sanity by a thread. Chanty's breath came faster, even though Vasper's movements were gentle. Their shared pleasure was growing stronger by the second. The desperation in his voice mirrored Chanty's own longing, her breathing quickening as she teetered on the edge of desire. Chanty could feel Vasper's struggle to restrain himself. She could feel his struggle, the battle between his love for her and the primal urge to claim her fully. "Vasper, I want you. Take me," Chanty urged, her face reflecting her desperate need to be fully his, to give him her virginity and her entire being. Her plea was a breathless whisper, her eyes reflecting the depth of her need. She was ready to give herself to him completely, to surrender her virginity and her soul, while he fought to hold himself back. But Vasper silenced her plea with a kiss, locking his lips with hers to stop her from adding to his struggle, for he was holding on to his self-control by a thread. Locking his lips with hers to stop the words that would undo him. Still, his hips continued to move against her, careful not to hurt her too much, even though they were only at the surface, each gentle thrust driving them both closer to the edge. As they neared the climax, their bodies responded to each other's every movement, their bodies moved in perfect harmony, each responding to the other's need. Chanty's arms wrapped tightly around Vasper, holding him as if her very life depended on it. Using all his strength to keep from slipping inside her. He's, trembling with the effort to hold back, a guttural moan rumbled from Vasper's throat, and Chanty, breaking free from Vasper's kiss, cried out in ecstasy as they both reached their peak together. Their heavy breathing mingled with the sound of the waves crashing against the shore under the starry sky. When it was over, they lay still, their bodies slick with sweat and trembling from the aftershocks of their passion. Vasper propped himself up on his elbow, still hovering over Chanty as they both waited for their heartbeats to return to normal. "I love you," Vasper said in a sultry voice, echoed by Chanty, and their lips met again. After a few moments, when their heartbeats had finally settled, Chanty grabbed Vasper's discarded t-shirt and used it to clean up their essence. Vasper rolled off to the side, pulling Chanty's head to rest on his arm. He hugged her tightly. "I thought I was going to lose it there for a second," Vasper chuckled softly, his voice laced with both relief and lingering desire. "I'm just glad I managed to hold back," he added with a grin, his breath still uneven. Chanty, too overwhelmed to respond, simply moaned in agreement, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment at her earlier plea. for having urged Vasper to enter her. If it had happened, if they had crossed that line, their chance at a peaceful life, free from Alexander Mondragon's shadow, might have been lost forever. You were wild earlier. I almost lost control, Vasper teased, his voice playful yet heavy with the truth of how close they had come to losing themselves in each other. Sorry, Chanty whispered, her voice small and apologetic. But Vasper silenced her with a kiss, sealing her apology with love, his lips capturing hers with a passion that told her there was nothing to apologize for. In that moment, their love was all that mattered, a love so deep and consuming that it defied reason and consequence. Chanty felt a slight tremor course through her body as they landed from the teleportation, the sensation lingering as she found herself in Vasper's arms. He had brought her to her room in David's mansion, just before David will depart for the inner world. She remained encased in Vasper's strong embrace, her body reluctant to fully awaken, yet knowing she must. Her mind, still drowsy from the sudden shift, urged her to stay in the comforting warmth of his embrace. The familiar scent of her room, mingled with the soft aroma of the air freshener, confirmed her location. Instinctively, she tightened her hold on Vasper, who responded by pulling her closer in a mutual embrace. Their eyes remained shut, but their ears were attuned to the sounds outside the room, Vasper's senses especially sharp. They were both acutely aware of the presence of the 6 guardians and Jake within David's mansion. Neither opened their eyes, but they were acutely aware of the world beyond their quiet sanctuary, Vasper's senses especially attuned. They could hear the subtle sounds outside the room. Chanty's ears caught the distant noise from the kitchen, the voices of Samuel, Laura, and another assistant, while Lorena had yet to awaken. Amidst the clinking of utensils, she discerned David's soft voice, indicating he was having coffee. They were here. Lewis's words resonated with certainty, referring to Vasper and Chanty. Their presence was known in the room. A soft smile played on Chanty's lips. Having powers that heightened their senses was an advantage, she mused. Meanwhile, Vasper was fully awake, his hands unable to remain still as they roamed over her body, her lower back, her legs. His touch was restless. His hands wandered over her body, exploring her curves with a restless hunger. She allowed him to continue, savoring the tender moment with her eyes still closed, though she felt the urgency in his caress savoring the moment, even as his hands explored her form. His touch was gentle yet possessive, as if reassuring himself that she was truly there with him. The peaceful silence between them was broken by the sound of David's voice, firm and serious. "Jake, are you ready? You understand what you're about to go through, right? The jury won't accept your reasoning, it's no longer valid. You can still change your decision, Jake." The gravity in David's tone stirred Chanty fully awake, and Vasper's movements stilled as they both listened intently, waiting for Jake's reply. Chanty, her face nestled against Vasper's chest, heard Jake's calm yet resolute response. "I won't change my decision, David. I'll face my punishment if I must, but I won't back down." His voice was steady, a quiet strength in his resolve as he sipped his coffee. David exhaled deeply, regretting the potential loss of Jake from their group, though still grateful to have him as a friend, a mix of regret and acceptance weighing on his shoulders. The possibility of losing Jake from their group was heavy, but David knew the choice was now Jake's alone. The outcome was now in Jake's hands, whether he would assist them or not. Marco and Justin stood at the table, watching David intently. Jacob, also with his coffee, sat with them, all ready for their journey to the inner world. "Justin, Marco," David began, his voice commanding, "when I return, I expect the repairs on this house to be complete. I'm considering purchasing another property, one that's far from the public eye." He added, "Weren't we supposed to stay on Vasper's Island?" Justin asked. "Lewis and Gabriel can handle that. One of you should supervise here to expedite the repairs," David added. Marco nodded, a sense of duty in his expression. "Don't worry, David. By the time you return, the work will be done," Marco said. David then reminded them, "And remember, none of you are to bring any communication devices when you're on the island. No radios, nothing." Gabriel chuckled. "It's going to be quiet out there, David. No boats, no yachts, unlike Jake's beach, where we could at least hop to another island thanks to his yacht. Can we at least bring some girls with us?" His jest caused laughter around the table, except from Jake and Jacob. Jacob smiled faintly, but Jake remained serious, his mood unshaken by Gabriel's humor. It's going to be awkward out there, just the guys on a beach. Vasper's the only one with a girlfriend, while the rest of us are left out, Gabriel complained, his words eliciting more laughter from Marco and Justin. David, his brow furrowed at their banter, wondered whether he should indulge in their jokes. I thought you already had a girlfriend, Gabriel? Marco teased. You said she was enough, and now you're looking for another? An extra? Gabriel grinned mischievously, of course. I want to be like Vasper, fought over by 2 women, just to make life more exciting, more challenging. His remark sent the group into another round of laughter, even Jacob joining in. Jake, however, remained unimpressed, his gaze fixed on Gabriel. Jake, you're such a killjoy. Gabriel taunted, though his words held no malice. It's just a joke, you know? Do you have to be so serious all the time? Gabriel's playful tone did nothing to lighten Jake's mood, but David intervened, all right, enough of that. I need to grab my things and get ready. With that, he stood and headed down the hallway towards his room, leaving the others to their laughter. Meanwhile, Vasper and Chanty, unable to sleep any longer after Gabriel's jesting, began to stir. Vasper was irritated by Gabriel's jokes, which seemed to target his life directly, and Chanty, too, was troubled by their situation, feeling as though she and Samara were in some sort of competition for Vasper. The light-hearted banter had inadvertently brought their minds back to the complex dynamics they were entangled in. Chanty slipped out of bed and headed to the bathroom, where she took a warm shower, brushed her teeth, and wrapped herself in a towel before drying her hair with a blow-dryer. The heat of the blow-dryer a welcome comfort against the cool air. Emerging from the bathroom, she felt refreshed, but Vasper's intense gaze met her, his desire palpable. His eyes intoxicated. Dark with longing, locked onto hers, but Chanty chose to ignore it, moving towards the closet to get dressed. But before she could do so, before she could reach it, Vasper was on her in an instant. Vasper swiftly pulled her back and placed her on the bed. The speed of his movements left Chanty breathless, her mouth slightly agape in surprise. He laid her down, his movements urgent, and removed her towel with a fluid motion. His hands already exploring her most sensitive areas between her thighs, his touch igniting a fire within her. Chanty gasped for air, but no sound escaped her lips. Everything was silent, except the rapid beating of her heart. The heat between them grew as Vasper's head descended, his lips and tongue working hungrily on her, feasting hungrily, making her breath hitch in her throat, drawing soft gasps from her lips. Chanty propped herself up on her elbows, watching Vasper intently, his actions consuming her, as if he were starving, her breath catching as his ministrations became more fervent. She bit down on a pillow to stifle any noise, her hand tangling in his hair as her body responded to his touch, the pleasure building with every second. As his movements intensified, as Vasper's tongue worked faster, her body arched in response, her breaths coming quicker, the sensation overwhelming. She was on the brink, her muscles tensing, her body desperate, and Vasper sensed it, increasing the pace of his ministrations. When Chanty finally reached her climax, she released the pillow, her mouth open in a silent cry, her body trembling with the force of it. Time seemed to stop as she collapsed onto the bed, her gaze fixed on the ceiling, still intoxicated, her chest heaving with the aftershocks of her release. Vasper gently cleaned her with his tongue, his eyes filled with love and admiration as he looked up at her. He smiled tenderly as he climbed up to meet her lips, their kiss passionate and deep. I love you, Vasper whispered softly, only for her to hear. I love you too, Chanty responded just as sweetly. You should get dressed, Vasper murmured, his voice low and intimate, his eyes holding hers, making only her privy to the words. Chanty smiled and rose, her nerves still tingling, and Vasper watched her with eyes full of contentment and love as she dressed. She chose a matching jogger set. Comfortable and casual. And once she was ready, together, they made their way out of the room, heading towards the living room where David was waiting for them, the weight of their next steps heavy in the air. Vasper and Chanty slowly walked toward the living room, their hands gently intertwined. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension, a delicate balance hanging between them. As they entered the room, where Lorena had already awakened and now stood silently against the wall, her eyes intently focused on David, Jacob, and Jake, who were seated on the sofa. The gaze of everyone in the room was drawn to Vasper and Chanty, except for Jacob and Jake. Jake's expression was deadly serious, his eyes fixed straight ahead at the door. His jaw was clenched tight, fists balled in barely restrained irritation at Vasper's presence. His body radiated a simmering tension, a clear sign of the disdain he held for Vasper. Jake knew what just recently happened in the room with Vasper and Chanty. His enhanced hearing power captured all the faintest sound he wished to hear. Jacob, on the other hand, had his gaze locked on David, who sat directly across from him. Vasper held Chanty by the waist, his focus solely on her, deliberately avoiding any direct glance towards the guardians, though he was clearly listening. Lorena, meanwhile, stood with her head bowed, occasionally casting a glance at Chanty. With a mix of concern and contemplation, David broke the silence, his voice calm yet decisive. "I'll be leaving soon, Chanty. You will be leaving with Louis, Gabriel, and Marco. Justin will stay behind to manage the repairs at my home and monitor the progress. Please, no one is to bring any communication devices of any kind." David's voice rang with authority, the kind that brooked no argument. David's authoritative tone cut through the room, and Gabriel responded, "Understood, David." Gabriel echoed David's sentiment with a firm nod. He responded with firm respect. "Can Lorena come along?" "She hasn't seen the sea in a long time," Shanta suggested. Lorena's face lit up with excitement. "Lorena can come with us to the island." While Lorena's eyes brightened at the mention of joining the trip, Chanty noticing the excitement that lit up Lorena's face at the idea. David's gaze shifted to Lorena, and after a brief moment of consideration, he nodded in agreement. And Lorena beamed with a broad smile, radiating happiness. "All right, we'll be heading out now. You take care of things here," David announced as he stood up, followed by Jacob and Jake. "So, you all take care of things here," David declared. All three men were strikingly handsome, exuding power and authority in their perfectly tailored suits. Their mere presence was enough to intimidate any man who lacked the confidence to stand his ground. But there was something different about Jake today. His stature seemed more robust, his chest more defined, and something caught Shanta's eye, a new black crystal earring on his left ear. She hadn't noticed it before, but now, it only caught her attention, because Jake had turned slightly, refusing to look in Vasper's direction. It became clear. Vasper glanced briefly at the trio, but quickly averted his eyes from Jake's intense stare. The Guardians remained focused on David. The Guardians, focused and alert, were clearly ready for anything. David's gaze softened as he addressed Chanty directly. "Chanty, stay safe while we're gone. Don't be alone too often," David said, his eyes locking onto hers with a protective, almost paternal intensity. Chanty nodded, smiling softly at him. Chanty felt a warmth in David's words. "You too, David. Take care over there," Chanty replied, her voice tender. Jake finally looked at her. His gaze was different from anyone else's, a look that made Vasper's anger flare. Jake didn't smile. His eyes were fixed on Chanty, serious and full of unspoken words. Jacob also kept his eyes on Chanty, mirroring Jake's intensity. The Guardians' expressions were equally serious, watching David closely, remained vigilant, watching their leaders intently. "Chanty, all the papers are in the office. If you need any in-depth discussions about the meetings, Marie can assist you," David added with a final authoritative note, as a final instruction. Chanty smiled and nodded. "Thank you, David." David and Jacob placed their hands on Jake's shoulders, and as they prepared to leave, Jake's gaze lingered on Chanty, never breaking until the last moment. Just before they vanished, Jake's eyes shifted to Vasper, their sharp stares meeting in a brief but intense exchange, locking onto him in a sharp, challenging stare. The room was thick with tension as they disappeared, leaving Chanty and Vasper standing there. Gabriel sat back down on the sofa, quietly observing the scene. Chanty turned to Vasper. "We can go to the island later tonight. I need to review the papers in David's office first. You can go back to your place if you have other work to do," she suggested with a smile. Vasper returned her smile, nodding. "I'll come back here before dinner," he replied, giving Shanta's hand a gentle squeeze. Shanta nodded, smiling back, and they kissed before Vasper disappeared. As soon as he was gone, Lorena approached Chanty, asking what she would like for breakfast. Chanty simply requested a cappuccino and toast with feta cheese. Lorena nodded and promptly prepared her request. Meanwhile, Gabriel observed the surroundings from the living room, sensing the subtle shifts in the atmosphere as the dawn slowly approached. Chanty returned to her room, lying down as thoughts swirled in her mind about what needed to be done that day. She needed to finalize her plans for her mansion and discuss things with Marie. Despite a pounding headache, she forced herself to review the papers, pleased with the results of the meeting. If all the proposed projects for her vineyards were realized, it would greatly benefit many families in their town. There were also plans to turn the vineyards into a tourist attraction, allowing visitors to experience the vineyard life firsthand, bringing more recognition to their town, open to visitors who wished to experience the winemaking process firsthand, which would further put their town on the map. However, Chanty couldn't ignore the fact that most of the proposals were from Leica. She saw nothing wrong with the meetings, knowing that David would have objected if there were any issues. She knew that David wouldn't have allowed anything questionable to pass. The financial reports showed no problems either, but her headache worsened as she noticed 4 more folders needing review, all concerning her father's remaining businesses. She leaned back in her chair, rolling her neck to ease the tension. The door creaked open, and Lorena entered, bringing her some snacks. Chanty glanced at the clock. It was already past 10 a.m. "Thank you, Lorena," Chanty said as Lorena placed the food tray on the small table beside her. Lorena flashing a smile before leaving the room quietly. Chanty couldn't help but reflect on how much her father's early training had prepared her for these moments. If her father, Don Lorenzo, hadn't trained her from a young age, Chanty doubted she could handle all these papers. She was grateful that her father had involved her in the family business early on, teaching her how to review their records. Even though they had a secretary and a lawyer, her father was always hands-on with the vineyard's management, never missing a day. It was only recently that Chanty had been away from the vineyard so often. Chanty took a sip of the cranberry juice Lorena had prepared and nibbled on a slice of strawberry cake. Time seemed to slip away as she delved into the next folder, this one concerning their gold mining operations. As she reviewed a folder containing reports on their gold mining site, the more she read, the more problems she uncovered. The issues were glaring, environmentalists were protesting against the operations, and the profits, though significant, were causing extensive damage to the environment. A whole town was affected, with the watershed nearly compromised. Chanty's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the reports and accompanying photos, unable to fathom the extent of the damage to the mountain. The sight of the devastation was overwhelming. She felt a surge of stress and stood up, moving away from the desk to process the gravity of what she was reading. Looking at the photos. "I can't do this," she muttered to herself. The weight of responsibility bearing down on her. As if sensing her distress. Just then, Lorena peeked through the door, reminding Chanty that it was time for lunch. Chanty left the office, joining the 4 guardians for a meal. The dining table was silent as they ate, Chanty's mind preoccupied with the mining business and what she should do. After a moment, she turned to Justin. "Can you get Miss Marie, Justin?" Chanty asked, referring to their family lawyer. Justin nodded in agreement, and after lunch, he went to fetch Marie. She arrived an hour later, apologizing for the traffic. "Sorry for the delay, traffic was bad," Justin explained, and Marie greeted Chanty with a hug and warm smile. They talked in the living room before heading to David's office for an in-depth discussion about her father's business. They spent hours there, finally wrapping up their conversation around 4 p.m. Chanty was grateful for Lorena, who diligently tended to their needs, though the fatigue was evident in Chanty's eyes by the time they were done. Exhaustion was evident on her. As she walked Marie out to Justin's car, she held an invitation card from Jasmine's farewell party, tucked among the reports David had left for her. In just over a week, Jasmine and her siblings would be leaving for another country, leaving no family behind. Returning to her room, Chanty decided to take another cold shower to wake up her drowsy senses, hoping it would revive her weary nerves. As the cold water cascaded over her skin, jolted her awake, the scent of shampoo and soap soothing her tired mind, soothing her senses, bringing a momentary relief from the day's stress. She lingered under the shower, letting the water wash away her fatigue before stepping out to blow-dry her hair. She decided to change into something casual yet stylish. Though they were only going to the beach later, Chanty chose to wear skinny, tattered pants and an off-shoulder tube top. As she looked at herself in the mirror, a smile formed on her lips, pleased with the way the outfit accentuated her figure. She hadn't worn something like this. Lorena had bought it for her, and it accentuated the perfect shape of her body. The skinny pants highlighted the curve of her hips, buttocks, and legs, while the tube top emphasized the beauty of her bust, revealing the smooth skin of her shoulders and the graceful shape of her long, slender arms. Her tiny waist added to her allure, her alluring beauty enhanced by her thick, flowing hair. As Chanty stepped out of her room, Lorena noticed her and gasped. "Miss Chanty, thank you for wearing that. I thought you didn't like it. It suits you so well. You looked stunning. You're gorgeous." Lorena's eyes sparkled with admiration, her gaze roaming over her appreciatively. Chanty laughed, genuinely appreciating Lorena's compliment. "No wonder, you've got all these handsome men fighting over you," Lorena added playfully, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Chanty laughed, but she appreciated Lorena's compliment. Chanty returned to her room to catch a short nap while waiting for Vasper. She lay down on her bed, clutching a pillow tightly in her arms. Within minutes, she drifted off to sleep, her mind replaying all the conversations she had with Marie, including the plans to rebuild her mansion. Chanty was eager to find the engineer or architect who had originally designed their mansion, hoping they were still alive. Marie knew the family that had contracted the mansion's construction. The thought of her childhood home being rebuilt in its former location filled Chanty with excitement. As her thoughts swirled, she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Suddenly, she awoke to the gentle rocking of the bed and felt someone lying beside her, pressing against her back. A smile crept across her face, for she knew only Vasper could make her feel this way. She let out a soft, contented moan, acknowledging Vasper's presence without fully waking up. He wrapped his arms around her tightly, pressing tender kisses to her neck and hair. She grasped his arm, still heavy with sleep, feeling the warmth of his lips travel from her neck to her exposed shoulder and arm. Chanty could only respond with a soft moan. "Vasper, I'm so sleepy," she murmured with a sleepy sigh. But Vasper only held her tighter, and Chanty, still smiling, kept her eyes closed, feeling his grip intensify as he captured her lips in a heated kiss. His kisses were so warm, so consuming, that Chanty opened her mouth, allowing Vasper to explore her lips, tongue, and almost every breath. His hand began to roam over her breasts, slipping under her tube top. Chanty remained still, letting Vasper shower her with kisses from her mouth down to her neck. Her hand found its way to Vasper's head, but then she noticed something. The texture of his hair felt different. A shock ran through her, and she abruptly pulled away from his kisses. "Vasper?" Chanty called out, pushing against his chest to see his face. But when she opened her eyes, it was dark. She couldn't see anything, and when she reached out, she realized there was no one beside her. She touched the empty space next to her, confirming that she was alone. Staring at the ceiling, barely visible, she realized she had been dreaming. She placed her hand on her forehead, the sensations from the dream still lingering. The warmth of Vasper's embrace and the heat of his palm on her breast felt so real that her heart raced. Her top had slid down, leaving her breast exposed. Startled, she quickly sat up, adjusted her tube top, and got out of bed. Slowly, she made her way to the light switch and turned it on, looking back at the bed. Was I really dreaming about Vasper? She wondered aloud. But why did everything feel so real? She touched her lips, still fresh with the sensation of his fiery kisses. Walking back to the bed, she touched her shoulder and arm, the places where Vasper's lips had pressed against her skin. Was it just her fatigue playing tricks on her mind? She glanced at the wall clock, nearly 7 p.m., but Vasper was still nowhere to be found. She stepped out of her room and saw Gabriel, Marco, and Louis in the living room, playing cards. Gabriel looked up at her. "Chanty." "Vasper still isn't back, and it's almost 7 p.m., Louis commented with a smile. Chanty returned the smile and headed to the dining table, where Lorena was setting up dinner. Lorena smiled as she looked at Chanty. "You must have had a good nap, Miss Chanty," she remarked. Shanta smiled softly. Yes, I did. I slept so well. We should have dinner before Vasper arrives, she suggested quietly. But as she turned to call Louis and the others, Vasper suddenly appeared before her. Startled for a moment, she quickly smiled and wrapped her arms around him, and Vasper hugged her tightly in return, pressing a warm kiss to her lips. Lorena left them alone, understanding their moment. I missed you, Vasper whispered, his eyes filled with longing. Shanta smiled, meeting his gaze. But it's only been a few hours since we last saw each other, she teased. Vasper smiled back, his eyes full of warmth. It feels like days to me, he replied. Eyes full of longing. Shanta laughed, her eyes never leaving Vasper's as she heard the 4 guardians approaching the dining table, each taking their seats. Shanty gently pulled Vasper to sit beside her, but he hesitated. It was his first time eating with the guardians, who had once been his enemies. Once all the food was laid out on the table, Shanty turned to Lorena. Lorena, why don't you join us for dinner? She offered kindly. Lorena smiled warmly. Thank you, Miss Shanty, but I'll eat with Samuel and the others in the kitchen. Shanty nodded, smiling in return. Meanwhile, Justin grinned as he looked at Vasper. Is this the first time Vasper's joining us for dinner? What a miracle, he remarked with an amused tone. Shanty smiled at Vasper, who looked slightly uncomfortable, while Louis and Gabriel remained indifferent. They began to eat, and it was clear that Vasper was enjoying the meal. Shanty smiled. Isn't Laura, David's cook, amazing? Vasper nodded, smiling in agreement. Marco and Justin exchanged smiles, pleased that Vasper appreciated their cook skills. Laura is an excellent cook, Shanty. She's been with us for so long that she even taught Jake some of her skills, Marco added, his voice light with humor. As the conversation continued, Vasper's mood shifted at the mention of Jake's name. Jake was the only one patient enough to watch Laura cook. He practically lived in the kitchen with her back then. Whenever Jake cooked, we thought it was Laura's work, but it was actually Jake's, Marco explained, laughing along with the others, except for Vasper, who remained silent. Realizing the change in Vasper's demeanor, Marco quickly apologized. Sorry about that. Shanty noticed Vasper's reaction and, with a gentle touch, placed her hand on his inner thigh. This small gesture made Vasper smile as he looked at her, his mood lifting instantly. When Shanty tried to withdraw her hand, Vasper held it in place, their smiles growing as they exchanged a knowing look. The guardians, watching from the table, smiled, recognizing the sweet tension between Shanty and Vasper. The dinner continued with light-hearted conversation until it was time for the servants to clear the table. Louis and the others began preparing for their move to Vasper's island. I prefer Vasper's teleportation power. I don't get dizzy unlike with Jake, Justin remarked, his voice carrying to Shanty as they gathered in the living room. Meanwhile, Shanty and Vasper were back in their room. Vasper sat on the bed, while Shanty stood between his legs, her arms wrapped around his neck as he held her tightly. I love you, Vasper whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I love you too, Vasper, Shanty replied, leaning in for a kiss, but Vasper responded with an even more passionate kiss, holding her even tighter. When their lips finally parted, Shanty gazed into Vasper's eyes, a thought crossing her mind. She remembered her dream. What is it? Vasper asked, noticing her sudden change in expression. Earlier, when I woke up, I thought you were here. I had a dream that felt so real. Shanty's voice trailed off, piquing Vasper's curiosity. Really? What did you dream about? He asked, intrigued. Shanty pouted, unsure if she should share. She felt a bit embarrassed. Nothing, forget about it. It was just a dream, she replied, trying to dismiss it. She attempted to move away, but Vasper wouldn't let her go. Aren't we supposed to leave soon? Shanty asked, laughing as she looked at Vasper. Not until you tell me about your dream, Vasper insisted, tightening his embrace. Shanty tilted her head to meet his lips. You can see it in my memories, she said softly, kissing him. As Vasper held her around the waist, he lifted Shanty onto his lap, straddling him. They exchanged heated kisses, but as Vasper delved into Shanta's memories, he saw everything, from the moment she left David's mansion to the scene in her dream. The intensity of the memory made Vasper hold her even tighter. His grip even tightened when he reached the part where Chanty was in the shower. He lingered there, causing Chanty to smile as she playfully slapped his shoulder. They both smiled, lips still locked, and continued until Chanty changed into fresh clothes. Vasper's hand squeezed her bottom, still holding onto her body. Eventually, Vasper saw the part where Chanty fell asleep and the moment she woke up, feeling his embrace. When he reached the point where she woke up to darkness, Vasper's muscles tensed, and his hold on Chanty became firmer as she straddled him at the edge of the bed. Finally, he saw the dining table scene in her memory. When their lips finally parted, both gasped for air, their eyes locked in an intense stare. "It was just a dream, but it felt so real," Chanty whispered, still catching her breath. Vasper's lips curled into a smile as his gaze lingered on her, his eyes holding her in a prolonged, intense stare. Then, with a subtle nod, he spoke, his voice gentle yet filled with certainty. "Yes, it's all just a dream." Chanty returned his smile, her eyes softening as Vasper pulled her into a tight embrace, his arms wrapping around her as if he could never let go. He kissed her fervently, as though each moment could be their last, pouring all his emotions into the kiss. He laid her down on the bed, and with a fluid motion, he positioned himself above her, their lips never parting, his mouth exploring hers, hungry and consuming. "Chanty, I love you so much," Vasper whispered against her lips, his voice low and sultry, filled with raw emotion. "I don't know what I would do if I lost you." Chanty pulled away just enough to gaze into Vasper's eyes, her own filled with love and vulnerability. "We're the same, Vasper," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "I don't want to lose you either." The depth of her emotion was clear, and Vasper could see it, feel it. He leaned in again, capturing her lips in a heated kiss, their connection igniting once more. But just as their passion began to pull them deeper into the moment, Chanty gently reminded him, her voice breathless yet urgent, "Vasper, we need to go to the island. Gabriel and the others are waiting for us." Vasper sighed, a mix of frustration and affection in his gaze as he looked down at her. "I almost forgot," he admitted with a slight smile, glancing around as if remembering where they were, still in David's mansion. Reluctantly, he pushed himself up, offering his hand to Chanty and helping her to her feet. But before they could leave the room, he pulled her into another passionate kiss, deep and lingering, as if it might never end. By the time they arrived at the island beach, it was already past 9 p.m. They stood in the living room of the house, and Gabriel and Louis, who were experiencing Vasper's teleportation power for the first time, were clearly amazed. Unlike Jake, they didn't feel the usual dizziness, no nausea or discomfort at all, just a smooth transition. Even Lorena was surprised at how effortless it felt, nothing like the sickness Lorena always complained about. But with Vasper, everything seemed different. So smooth. Vasper wasted no time as he opened the door to the house, stepping aside to let Lorena take in her surroundings. "This is our house on the island," Chanty explained, her voice warm. "The kitchen is over there. It's a small place, but it's cozy." Lorena looked around, clearly impressed, especially when she stepped outside and saw the white sand beach glowing under the starry night sky. Chanty, too, noticed how much brighter the front beach seemed, as if illuminated by some unseen light. Vasper smiled, taking Chanty's hand and gently pulling her outside. "Gabriel, your room is over there," he pointed, "and Lorena, yours is next to his." They all stepped outside, and Chanty was surprised to see 5 large mobile homes lined up, beautifully arranged with their entrances facing each other and large glass windows overlooking the beach. Air conditioning was installed, making them perfect for a comfortable stay. Lorena couldn't hide her amazement as she looked at the spacious mobile homes, each large enough to provide more than enough space for one person. "Did you set all this up just for one day?" Chanty exclaimed, her eyes shining with admiration. Vasper nodded, his voice calm as he replied, "Yes, it was no trouble." He leaned in to kiss Chanty passionately, their lips lingering, before the guardians each picked up their own mobile homes. Marco, Gabriel, and Louis explored their chosen spaces, while Lorena did the same, each finding a fully stocked personal fridge, with everything from beer to wine, all standard-sized and fully equipped. As for Chanty and Vasper, they remained inside the main house. The others, their guardians, had settled into their beds, drifting off to sleep, leaving Chanty and Vasper to themselves. Lorena briefly stepped out to thank them before heading back to her mobile home, and Vasper and Chanty only nodded in response before closing the door, leaving it unlocked. Chanty couldn't stop smiling as she looked at Vasper, her happiness radiating from her. They made their way to their room, where Vasper immediately pulled her into a tight embrace, and together they fell onto the bed. Chanty let out a playful scream, laughing as Vasper's weight pressed down on her, the soft mattress cushioning their fall. She noticed the mattress was softer than before, another change Vasper must have made. As they steadied themselves on the bed, Chanty looked up at Vasper, who was now hovering over her. "I love you, Vasper," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. Vasper responded with a deep kiss, his lips meeting hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "I love you more, Chanty," he murmured against her lips as his hands moved to undo the buttons and zipper of her pants, pulling them off in a hurried motion. His eyes were dark, intoxicated with desire. Suddenly, the scene shifted, and they found themselves on the southern shore of the island, surrounded by large rocks. Chanty laughed, looking around in amazement, under the moonlight and clear starry skies casting a soft glow on their surroundings. "I miss you so much," Vasper whispered against her lips, his hands already exploring her body. Chanty's arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair, as Vasper's hand slipped beneath her lingerie, causing her to moan deeply, her hips moving instinctively against him. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, the intensity of their desire building as Vasper quickly discarded Chanty's lingerie, his hands never pausing in their exploration of her sensitive skin. Chanty's soft moans of Vasper's name were like prayers carried on the wind, mingling with the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. They wrapped themselves in a thick comforter, the darkness of the night illuminated by the moonlight and the cool breeze mixing with their deep moans, the sounds of their shared pleasure and love echoing around them. Vasper's longing for Chanty was finally soothed, as was Chanty's for him. Both were left breathless, their bodies trembling with the aftermath of their ecstasy. Vasper lay down beside her, pulling her close as he lifted her head onto his arm, holding her tightly against his bare chest. They were both naked beneath the comforter, their clothes discarded at the foot of the bed. Vasper's lips returned to Chanty's forehead, kissing her repeatedly down to her lips, each kiss accompanied by endless declarations of love. Chanty's joy was immeasurable as she lay wrapped in Vasper's embrace, the world outside forgotten in the warmth of his arms. Under the thick comforter, Chanty slept peacefully, wrapped tightly in Vasper's embrace. But Vasper's eyes remained wide open, the torment of his thoughts keeping sleep at bay. His mind replayed the memory of Chanty, the darkness around them failing to obscure the vivid image etched into his heart. It was as if each flash of the memory stabbed at his chest, a wound deepened by the sight of Chanty, her expression a mix of confusion and longing. Vasper had forced himself to smile, to reassure Chanty that it was all just a dream, but his heart mourned bitterly for what he had witnessed. The man beside Chanty, the one she thought was Vasper, was Jake. A surge of anger boiled within Vasper as he recalled the moment Jake had teleported into the room. The darkness had enveloped them, and Jake, careful not to disturb the silence, had slipped into the bed beside Chanty. What followed was a sight that nearly drove Vasper to madness. He had watched, helpless, as Jake leaned in, his face illuminated just enough for Vasper to see the change in his expression when Chanty murmured Vasper's name. But Jake hadn't stopped, he had continued, and the sight of Chanty responding to Jake's kiss was like a dagger twisting in Vasper's chest. His rage was palpable, a fire that threatened to consume him. The sight of Jake's hands on Chanty, the way Chanty had held Jake's head, had broken something deep within Vasper. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Chanty to Jake, the agony of the scene branding itself into his soul. Yet he had to keep it buried, locked away as a mere nightmare in Chanty's mind. She could never know that it had been Jake she had kissed, not him. But the fury towards Jake was something Vasper could not contain. His fists clenched tightly, the tension in his body refusing to let him find rest. He was the only one who knew the truth of what had happened, he and Jake. To Chanty, it was all just a dream where she believed she had been with Vasper. But the reality was a bitter pill that Vasper couldn't swallow. He pulled Chanty closer, her soft moans in her sleep a fleeting comfort as she unconsciously responded to his embrace. "Chanty, I love you so much," Vasper whispered, his voice a mere breath in the silence, a declaration meant only for him to hear. I don't want to lose you. The night deepened, the air growing colder as the wind outside picked up, howling softly against their cover. Vasper's eyes drifted to the stars, their light shining faintly through the night. His heart ached as he silently pleaded, his words carried away by the wind. Please, don't take her from me. She belongs with me, only with me. His voice, a desperate murmur, seemed to reach out to the heavens, as if begging fate to grant him this one wish. Vasper's thoughts darkened further, the rage simmering beneath his skin. He should have ended Jake that night. He shouldn't have given him a chance to survive, a chance to come between him and Chanty. The thought of what he should have done gnawed at him, and every time his eyes closed, the image of Jake with Chanty replayed in his mind, a haunting vision that snapped him back to wakefulness. It was a nightmare that he couldn't escape, a fear that clung to him like a shadow, as if losing Chanty to Jake was a reality he was doomed to relive. He wasn't sure how long he stayed awake, lost in the endless cycle of his thoughts. The night wore on, the only movement coming from Vasper as he pressed tender kisses to Shanta's forehead and lips, over and over, silently expressing the love he couldn't let go of. In the quiet of the night, with nothing but his whispered declarations and Shanta's steady breathing, Vasper held on to her like she was his lifeline. Finally, through the haze of his torment, he used his teleportation ability to return them to their room, bringing the bed along with them. The slight jolt from the teleportation caused Chanty to stir, her soft moan echoing in the room. She tightened her arms around Vasper, unconsciously seeking his warmth and comfort, and he held her even closer, his lips brushing against her forehead once more. Vasper's heart was heavy, but his grip on Chanty was firm, determined to keep her close, to never let her go. The love he felt for her was fierce, all-consuming, a desperate force that drove him to protect her from the truth, from the pain he alone carried. In the darkness, with the wind as his only witness, Vasper made a silent vow to keep Chanty by his side, no matter the cost. As morning light seeped through the curtains, Shanta stirred awake, feeling the warmth of Vasper's lips pressing gently against hers. A soft, guttural groan escaped him, barely audible. "Good morning," he murmured in a hushed tone, his words a tender caress against her lips. Shanta smiled, her body stretching languidly as she tried to rise, but Vasper's arms tightened around her, pulling her back into his embrace. He playfully nipped at her neck, eliciting a burst of laughter from both of them. "I love you," Vasper whispered, his lips trailing soft kisses along her neck. "I love you too, Vasper," she replied, her voice husky from sleep and the lingering pleasure of a deep slumber. As her eyes fluttered open, they immediately caught sight of the clock. 8:45 a.m. Her eyes widened as she turned to Vasper, who was watching her with a mischievous grin. "Everyone's already had breakfast," Vasper chuckled, his eyes sparkling with amusement. "Lorena and the others are actually down at the beach, probably swimming by now. It's just the two of us left without breakfast. They cooked earlier this morning." Shanty noticed the redness in Vasper's eyes, a telltale sign of another sleepless night. Concern flickered in her gaze as she gently placed her palm against his cheek, caressing his face. "You didn't sleep again last night, did you? Your eyes, they show it." Vasper chuckled, knowing he couldn't hide the truth from her. His laughter, that intoxicating, heart-melting sound, was her weakness. His killer smile, too powerful to resist, made her feel as if she could float away into the heavens, lost in the beauty of his gaze. Unable to resist, she captured his lips in a deep kiss, but Vasper's response was even hotter, pulling her closer, his hands exploring every inch of her body. Vasper was fully clothed, but Shanty remained naked. She giggled at his reaction, trying to maintain some composure. "Vasper, I need to get up," she managed to say between his kisses, which had now moved to her neck, his hand resting on her breast, making it hard for her to resist being carried away by his touch. But Vasper, driven by an undeniable need, returned to her lips, kissing her passionately. As their lips parted, he gazed into her eyes with a serious expression. "I love you," he whispered, his voice filled with a depth of emotion. Shanty, equally serious, looked back at him. "I love you too, Vasper." Slowly, Vasper released her, standing beside the bed, and gently pulling Shanty up with him. They embraced once more after Shanty stood beside the bed. She reached for the bathrobe draped on the side of the bed and slipped it on, while Vasper's eyes followed her every movement. I'll take a quick shower and then I'll be right back, Chanty said with a smile. Vasper nodded, smiling mischievously. I'll prepare the food outside, we can eat there. Chanty smiled back, nodding, and watched as Vasper left the room. She entered the bathroom, took a quick shower, and after drying her hair, she stepped out in her bathrobe. Her eyes immediately landed on the large bouquet of red, white, and pink roses lying on the bed. She gasped in surprise, staring at the beautiful arrangement. Picking up the flowers, she noticed a card attached to the side. Good morning, Miss Gorgeous. I love you. She couldn't help but laugh. It was the first time Vasper had ever given her flowers. She had never received flowers from him before. The scent of the roses was intoxicating as she brought them closer to her face, inhaling deeply. Gently placing them back on the bed, she continued getting dressed, opting for a less revealing outfit since they had guests. She chose a matching jogger set, blow-dried her hair, and walked out of the room, carrying the flowers with her. As she stepped outside, she saw Vasper at the entrance of the house, smiling as he watched Lorena playing in the shallow part of the beach, clearly enjoying herself. But when Vasper's eyes shifted to Chanty and noticed the flowers in her hands, his smile faded, replaced by a look of confusion. Chanty smiled back at him. What's with the new style, Mr. Romantic? You've never given me flowers before, have you? She teased, her tone light. Vasper's smile was half-hearted as he stared at her, puzzled. Where did you get those? He asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Chanty's smile faded as well. In our room, on the bed. I found them there after my shower. Why? What's wrong, Vasper? She asked, concern creeping into her voice as she met his intense gaze. Vasper took the flowers from her, reading the card with clenched jaw. Chanty watched him, her worry growing as she noticed his reaction. Vasper, please don't tell me these aren't from you. They just arrived. Who put them in our room? Who are they from? She asked, her voice trembling. Vasper's eyes met hers, dark and stormy, filled with an anger that made her heart pound. I suspect they're from Jake, Vasper replied, his voice hoarse. Without a second thought, Chanty grabbed the flowers and stormed out to the back of the house, tossing them into the bushes. Her frustration with Jake boiled over. How dare he invade their private space again? He was impossible to reason with, always crossing boundaries. She had genuinely believed the flowers were from Vasper. When Chanty returned to the kitchen, Vasper was leaning against the island table, waiting for her, his face serious, his fists clenched, deep in thought. His lips were pressed tightly together as he stared at her, the weight of his thoughts heavy between them. As she approached, Vasper immediately pulled her into an embrace, guiding her outside where breakfast had been set up. Don't think about what just happened, he said quietly, his tone gentle yet firm. Let's eat first, it's already past 9 a.m. They held hands as they stepped outside, Chanty catching sight of Lorena playing in the shallow water while the three guardians swam in the deeper parts. Lorena waved enthusiastically at Chanty, her smile wide, and Chanty couldn't help but laugh in return. They walked over to the table that Vasper had set up under the shade of a large tree. He helped her into a seat, asking, Would you like some cappuccino? Chanty smiled at him, her voice playful. No, Your Highness, please join me, she replied, her tone teasing as it reached his ears. Vasper grinned mischievously, his eyes locked onto hers. Then let's eat, he said, his voice holding a promise of more to come. They began their meal, enjoying the view and the peacefulness of their surroundings. It was a paradise, one that seemed far removed from the tension that had earlier gripped them.